Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for the Turning Amen into Action Clarion Call. My name is Tim Block, Senior Program Director with Enterprise Community Partners, and I am honored to be here today with our partner for this event, the American Heart Association. We appreciate all of you taking the time to be here with us today, and while we wish we all could be together in person, we are thrilled to have participants from all over the Southeast and from other parts of the country as well on this virtual webinar. It is our pleasure to talk with you about the affordable housing crisis that we're currently experiencing across the nation, with a specific focus on the Southeast and the role that houses of worship can play in helping address those issues by turning amen into action. Before we continue with our program, a few housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. We ask that you please use the Q&A feature and not the chat when asking questions for our presenters. The chat feature can be used to interact and engage with fellow participants. Shortly following the webinar, we will be making available the recording, presentation slides, speaker bios, and a survey via email to all participants. Finally, I am fully aware that 4 hours is a long time to be on a webinar, and I'm sure we are all experiencing Zoom fatigue at this point. However, we encourage you to stay with us as best you can throughout the day, as we have some great content, speakers, and towards the end of the day, we'll be covering what we believe can be a valuable tool in helping houses of worship determine what technical assistance they may need in order to move their potential development projects forward. With that, now we will hear from Megan Shannon-Volkovic, VP and Southeast Market Leader for Enterprise Community Partners, and Kimberly Wright, Senior Vice President and Executive Director at the American Heart Association, who will make some opening remarks on behalf of both their organizations, followed by Pastor Marcus T. Watkins, Senior Minister at Simpson Street Church of Christ, who will briefly talk about his church's development efforts and then open us with a word of prayer. Megan?
Great, thanks, Tim. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And again, welcome to today's faith-based development webinar, Turning Amen into Action. First, I want to thank Tim for his leadership in our initiative and for organizing an incredible program today, as well as our panelists who have put time and energy in to participate, and our partner, the American Heart Association, and our funder, the Kresge Foundation. For those of you who are not familiar about Enterprise, we are a national nonprofit housing intermediary bringing capital policy and solutions to community development across the country. And our vision is a country where home and community are stepping stones to more. And our mission is to make home and community places of pride, power, and belonging, and platforms for resilience and upward mobility for all. And we do this through 3 pathways. 1, increasing housing supply. We invest in and advocate for the preservation and production of quality homes that people can afford. 2nd, we seek to advance racial equity, dismantling the legacy of systemic racism in housing, in policy, practice, and investment, which has become central to the work that we do. And then build resilience and upward mobility. We seek to strengthen people and places to prepare for and recover from shocks, such as climate disasters or the pandemic, to ultimately promote stability, well-being, and upward mobility. Having an affordable place and stable place to call home is a critical pathway for one's success. We know that in health and wellness, housing affordability means more money for fresh and healthy food each month. Families can afford preventative and needed health care. And in education, academic performance and graduation rates increase when children remain in stable housing. We also know that in economic mobility, living near transit and job centers reduces the cost of commuting, increases career prospects and pathways, and helps employers attract and retain workers. And in our research, we also know that producing and preserving affordable housing fuels the economy and creates jobs. In an analysis of Enterprise's own production and rehab, we've calculated that for every 100 units produced and preserved, there are 190 and 130 full-time jobs created, respectively. Finally, we know the demand for affordable housing outpaces supply. Rents are rising at dramatic rates while incomes remain stagnant. And the COVID impact has put hundreds of thousands of families at risk of eviction. Today, we will be talking.
Megan, you went on mute.
Today, I'm going to go back. Well, we're going to talk about more affordable housing options and how you can be a solution in that role. In our neighborhoods and our communities, we need more partners, such as houses of worships, to think about how they may incorporate their work in creating affordable housing or community development amenities. So thank you for participating today in the webinar and how you can join on to the call to action and become a partner in solutions. With that, I will turn it over to our partner, Kimberly Wright, the Executive Director at the American Heart Association.
Thank you, Megan, and good morning or afternoon to everyone. It is a delight to be on this call today. I'm excited about all the great content that will be shared. And as we've talked about, this is about turning amen into action, right? So we don't want to just learn, we want to equip our faith-based partners with the tools and resources to be a relentless force, along with the American Heart Association, to address inequities. And we all know that housing inequities is a challenge, and it does correlate with chronic disease and illness. And during the pandemic, it is shining a light on chronic disease and illness. And with that, we need to double down on focusing on those social determinants of health. Again, housing. We are proud to have been a long-standing partner with Enterprise Community Partners. When I started with the American Heart Association about 5 years ago, we were already working together. So I just want you to know that this is not a flavor of the month. This is not just us coming into this space and coming out. We are serious and relentless, and it takes a village. Also, we would not have been able to do this without a grant from the Kresge Foundation. So thank you for the support. So with that, I will turn it over to the great presenters and panelists that we have coming forward. And again, thank you so much for this collective impact and partnership to address housing in Atlanta.
Thank you, Kimberly. Pastor Watkins, can you please tell us a little about Simpson Street Church of Christ's development efforts, and then grace us with an opening word?
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate it. I want to say good day to everyone. As been noted, Marcus T. Watkins, Senior Minister of the Simpson Street Church of Christ. We're located at 800 Joseph B. Boone Boulevard, Northwest, so we're right in Vine City. I want to also thank Enterprise Community Partners and the American Heart Association for sponsoring this great event and also asking me to play a small role in it. I believe that this is a great partnership between affordable housing and the faith-based community. I've always believed that we should not only be Bible knowledgeable, Bible savvy, we also have to be boardroom knowledgeable and boardroom savvy, which means we have to step out of the church house sometimes and find out what is going on in our community. The good thing is that we're able to leave our church buildings and help more and more people. And until that is achieved, I don't believe we're living out the great commandment of love thy neighbor as thyself. 2 years ago, I was blessed to move from Hartford, Connecticut to Atlanta, Georgia, and I met a gentleman by the name of Leonard Adams. And immediately I understood that our goals complemented each other. And so we can no longer, I believe we can no longer stand behind the pulpit and tell people to go in peace when they don't have anywhere to go. And so what we have done, we have partnered with Quest to build affordable housing. We're looking at building 130 plus units right there in Vine City, because we want to be a blessing in the community that we sit in and the community that we serve. And so I hope that more individuals from the faith-based community can look at the assets and resources that we have and just be a blessing to people all over, regardless of their color, their race, their religion, what their sexual orientation or preference is. We're called to do good. And when we're called to do good, it does not matter about anything else. And so I'm looking forward to being a part of this community and also doing something great in the housing community. And hopefully we'll be able to break ground. We will be breaking ground this year, and you're all invited to come by and see how this partnership is actually working out. So thank you so much. And I will now lead us in a prayer, and then we will continue on with the rest of the webinar. Shall we humbly bow? God, thank you so much for this day that you've given us. We thank you for the minds of ministry that have assembled here on today. We thank you for the organizations that have assembled, and we also thank you for the resources that you have blessed us with. And help us to understand that the resources that you have blessed us with, it is not for us to be reservoirs, but for us to be conduits, because we are blessed to be a blessing. And we pray that those blessings will flow through us and benefit those who are less fortunate than us. We are truly your voice. We are truly the only eyes you have. We're the only ears that you have. We're the hands and the feet that you have. So we are representatives and ambassadors of the kingdom. And so we thank you for this day. We thank you for keeping us safe. We thank you for blessing our families. And we thank you for all of the things that our hands and our heart would touch, that it might bring you glory. And we ask this in the strong name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Pastor Watkins, for your message and the hope that comes with it. Next, it's my pleasure to introduce Dan Street, research analyst with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. Dan will be using data from the Outreach 2020 report that he helped author to highlight the affordable housing crisis nationally and in the Southeast. Dan, please begin.
Thanks, Tim. I want to thank Enterprise and particularly Tim Block for putting together such a great event. It's a real honor to be here. I'm Dan Street. I'm a research analyst for the National Low Income Housing Coalition. For anyone not familiar with our work, the coalition is a research and advocacy organization in Washington, D.C. We are dedicated to achieving socially just public policy that ensures that people with the lowest incomes in the United States have affordable and decent homes. Our focus is on households with the greatest needs, by and large, extremely low income renters who have incomes at or below 30% area median income or below the poverty level, who are disproportionately people of color. What I want to share with you today is just a brief overview of what we know about the national affordable housing crisis, about the lack of affordable and available housing for renters in Georgia and throughout the Southeast, and how that pre-existing crisis has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and economic downturn. Now, I'll start, as you can see on the next slide, by laying out some findings from our Out of Reach report. Out of Reach is an annual publication from the National Low Income Housing Coalition that highlights the gulf between the wages people earn and the price of decent rental housing in every state, metropolitan area, and county in the United States. The central statistic in the report, the housing wage, represents what a full-time worker would need to earn every hour in order to be able to afford rent and utilities at fair market rent. It gives us a quick heuristic for seeing why housing is unaffordable for many households. Now, on the next slide, you can see that in 2020, the national housing wage for a 2-bedroom apartment was $23.96 an hour. And the housing wage for a 1-bedroom apartment was $19.56 an hour. That is to say, to be able to pay for a modest 2-bedroom apartment without being cost burdened, a worker would need to earn $23.96 an hour. Now, the mean hourly wage for renters, though, was just $18.22 an hour, as I think we can see if we advance the slide another click. And of course, in many states, the minimum wage was just $7.25 an hour. Now, there are two things to understand about the housing wage. First, when we talk about what a household can afford, we're relying on the assumption, which is also reflected in federal housing policy, that no more than 30% of a household's gross income should be consumed by housing costs. We identify households that spend more than 30% of their income on housing as cost burdened. Second, we rely on HUD's fair market rents, or FMRs, to estimate what households would need to spend for decent housing if they were to move today. The base rent in an FMR area is typically set at the 40th percentile of standard quality gross rents. That means that these are rents for homes priced below the middle of the market, not for what we might call luxury housing. While there is variation across the country in housing costs and in minimum wages, nowhere in America do minimum wage full-time workers earn the 2-bedroom housing wage for their area. Now, the pandemic, of course, has had a profound impact on the economy. And while the housing wage is calculated from the latest available data, from reliable nationwide surveys on wages and housing costs, this data does not capture the unprecedented economic downturn. And the situation facing many low-wage workers today is considerably worse. The Economic Policy Institute, I believe just last week, published a report estimating that 80% of the 9.6 million net jobs lost in 2020 were jobs held by wage earners in the bottom quartile of the wage distribution. So what this out-of-reach data show then is that even before the crisis, during a period of much lower unemployment, low-wage workers were already struggling to afford the rent. This is a long-standing structural problem that will not go away on its own. Now, on the next slide, you can see some interstate variation in the housing wage. The 2-bedroom housing wage ranges from $14.19 an hour in Arkansas up to $38.76 an hour in Hawaii. There are high housing costs on the West Coast, in Florida, New York, New Jersey. That said, states with lower housing costs are generally also areas with lower wages. In Alabama, for instance, a renter needs to earn $15.44 an hour to be able to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. That's considerably lower than the national average. The mean renter wage in Alabama, though, is just $13.30 an hour. So what matters is not just the sticker shock of high rents, but the relationship between rents and wages. We can also see considerable variation by metropolitan area, which you can see on the next map. This map reflects the 1-bedroom housing wage rather than the 2-bedroom housing wage. And the gradient here, it reflects how many hours a minimum wage worker must work to be able to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. In the dark blue areas, the darkest blue areas, a minimum wage worker would need to work more than 80 hours every week to be able to afford a 1-bedroom apartment. You can see pockets of dark blue around Miami, Austin, San Francisco, New York City, the places that you often hear about when we're talking about high housing costs. But this is not a problem confined to a handful of small metros. In fact, in fewer than 5% of counties nationwide can a minimum wage worker with a standard 40-hour work week afford a 1-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. On average, a minimum wage worker needs to work 79 hours per week, all year round, to be able to afford a 1-bedroom rental home. Now, Out of Reach compares these housing wages to what workers across the country are actually earning. And I want to show you some of that on the next slide. We estimate what the average renter earns from the Bureau of Labor Statistics quarterly census of employment and wages. And our data on the median hourly wages by occupation comes from their Occupational Employment Statistics program. We look specifically at median hourly wages by occupation to capture the extent to which some jobs, in fact, some industries, fail to pay enough to afford rent. One striking finding in this last year's report is that 12 of the 20 largest occupations have median hourly wages that are less than the national 1- and 2-bedroom housing wage. Food and beverage serving workers at the bottom there make $11.24 an hour, and retail sales workers make $12.08 per hour. Home health aides at $12.94 an hour are not much better off. Now, those low-wage workers have been profoundly affected by COVID-19. In the initial downturn in March and April of 2020, we found that retail sales, accommodations and food service, and healthcare and social assistance, which includes home health aides, accounted for over half of all job losses. Because many of these low-wage workers weren't earning enough to afford their rent to begin with, many have been accumulating insurmountable debts due to loss of employment income, temporary furloughs, and layoffs in 2020. In January of this year, nearly 60% of renters said that they had lost employment income in 2020, and 21% of renters said they were not caught up on their rent payments. Among those with low incomes, those rates were even higher. Now, pulling back from specific occupations, on the next slide, you can see how out of reach housing is by comparing the housing wages on those dashed lines to the national hourly wage distribution. Now, this includes all wage and salary workers. The 50th percentile hourly wage, that's the median, of $19.68 an hour is just barely over the 1-bedroom housing wage of $19.56 an hour. And to be clear, nearly half of all workers make less than $19.68 an hour. The 2-bedroom housing wage is higher than what 60% of all workers earn. Now, this, I think, might even not give you the full picture, because the median wage for renter households is even lower at $18.22 an hour. There are stark racial inequalities at work here as well that we need to underscore. And on the next slide, you can see that when we put the wage distributions for white, Black, and Latino workers side by side, we can see that Black and Latino workers will face more significant struggles to afford housing. Each group of columns along the x-axis on this chart compare the relevant percentile wage for white workers, Black workers, and Latino workers. For instance, at the 50th percentile wage, the median wage, we see that the median white worker makes $21.71 an hour, which is enough to afford a 1-bedroom rental home at fair market rent. But the median Black worker at $16.41 an hour and the median Latino worker at $16.18 an hour do not. Now, I mentioned earlier that there is variation in costs and in wages by state. So I think it's worthwhile to drill down and take some local examples. And on the next slide, we'll take a look at Georgia to get a sense of how this variation plays out in practice. Now, Georgia's 2-bedroom housing wage of $19.11 an hour ranks number 27th among all states. So it's pretty close to the middle of the pack. But unfortunately, that does not translate into greater affordability for Georgia workers. The average renter wage in Georgia was just $17.51 an hour, and the minimum wage set at the federal level, $7.25 an hour. A minimum wage worker would need to work 91 hours a week, 52 weeks per year, to be able to afford a 1-bedroom rental home. There's also considerable variation within the state, as you can see on the next slide. In the Atlanta metro, someone needs to earn $22.44 an hour to be able to afford a 2-bedroom rental home. Now, that puts Atlanta in the most expensive 20% of all metros across the country. Savannah and Macon below, you can see, are a little cheaper, but the mean renter wages in those metros is still too little to afford those rents. Now, I want to shift to talk about the reasons why we see this pervasive nationwide housing affordability crisis. So I'll start by moving to the next slide, because this is it's a long-term structural problem that's rooted fundamentally in a shortage of affordable and available rental homes for the lowest income renters. Our other annual report, The Gap, helps explain that shortage and calculate how many more affordable rental homes we actually need. Now, this is a complicated chart, but I want to just highlight a couple of things from it. In the 2020 Gap report, we found that approximately 11 million extremely low-income renter households in the US. So on the far left there, you see that blue bar that says 10.9. That represents nearly 11 million households across the country who rent their homes and have extremely low incomes. That's 30% of area median income or the poverty level. So for a family of four, that's less than $26,000. Now, nationally, there are 7.3 million rental homes that are affordable to them. But many of those homes, which are on the private market, are occupied by higher income households. So really, there are only about 4 million rental homes that are both affordable and available for these extremely low income renters. So we have a shortage of about 7 million homes for these renters. Now, every state and every major metropolitan area and most counties has a shortage of affordable and available housing for extremely low income renters. Another way to see this shortage is on the next slide. We can see that for every 100 extremely low income renters, there are only 36 affordable and available homes. That's a dramatic shortage, and it declines as we move up the income ladder because this is fundamentally a problem for the lowest income renters. As a result of that shortage, nearly 86% of extremely low income renters are housing cost burdened. That is, they spend more than 30% of their income on rent. And more than 70% are severely cost burdened, which means they spend more than half of all of their income on housing. On the next slide, we have some statistics about that severe housing cost burden and how it's distributed. ELI renters, or extremely low income renters, account for about 72% of all severely cost burdened renters in the country. Extremely low income renters have little, if any, money remaining for other necessities after paying their rent. A severely housing cost, extremely low income family of four with, say, a monthly income of $2,008 a month has $762 remaining for all non-housing expenses after renting the average two-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. Now, the US Department of Agriculture has a thrifty food budget for a family of four, and that's $671 a month, which means that that family of four would have only $91 a month left over for all other necessities: transportation, childcare, healthcare, and so on. Suffice to say that severely housing cost burdened, extremely low income renters are making significant sacrifices to be able to pay for their housing. I think it's worth pointing out that this is a matter of racial injustice as well. Black, Native American, Latino, and Asian households are more likely than white households to be extremely low income renters. 20% of Black households are extremely low income renters. That's compared to 6% of white non-Latino households. Now, on the next slide, I can show you a map of the gap across the country. No state has an adequate supply of rental housing for the lowest income renters, as shown here. The supply ranges from 18 affordable and available rental homes for every 100 ELI renter households in Nevada, up to 62 in West Virginia. That's still a pretty substantial shortage even in West Virginia. No major metropolitan area has an adequate supply either. That ranges from 14 available and affordable rental homes for every 100 extremely low income renters in Las Vegas and Austin, Texas, up to 54 in Providence, Rhode Island. Now, the table on this next slide shows the size of the shortfall of affordable and available housing for extremely low income renters in the Southeast. in Alabama, Florida, Georgia, North and South Carolina, and Tennessee. Obviously, the size of the shortfall is partly a function of population size. So the point here is not to compare the problems between the states in the Southeast. Rather, I think it points up a sad and pretty shocking fact. If you look at this first column, the shortage of affordable and available rental homes for extremely low-income renters. The cumulative shortage for all of these states is over 1 million homes. 1 million more affordable rental homes that are needed for the lowest income renters. Because they cannot find affordable housing, the vast majority of these extremely low-income renters are paying more than half of their income on rent. That ranges from 66% in Alabama and Tennessee, all the way up to 79% of these renters spending more than half of their income on housing in Florida. So to start to close this off here, I just want to say a few words about why we see this shortage of affordable housing. In part, it's because the private market on its own will never supply enough. The severe shortage of affordable homes for extremely low-income renters is systemic. It consistently affects every state and metropolitan area during both periods of economic growth and recessions. During periods of growth, the rents that the lowest income households can afford to pay typically do not cover the development costs and operating expenses of new housing on their own. And while new construction for higher income renters can encourage a chain of household moves that eventually filters down to some lower income renters, new luxury units may not impact rents at the bottom of the market as much as they do rents at the top. This process doesn't impact the bottom of the market as much as could be hoped, because property owners have an incentive to upgrade their properties or to convert them to other uses as they age. Now, during downturns, as we saw in 2020, different segments of the rental market see different experiences. The median rent in a city can fall, as happened in 2020 for some major metropolitan areas, without the decline necessarily bringing relief to the bottom of the market. As higher income renters and distressed homeowners seek cheaper alternatives to their current housing, competition for the least expensive rental homes may actually increase. Consequently, rents for the least expensive homes may be less responsive to economic downturns. And in some cases, we could even see increased demand for those homes. So without a significant and sustained investment in providing deeply targeted housing for those renters, this shortage will persist. The COVID-19 public health and economic crisis has created an urgent need to keep families stably housed to save their lives. During the pandemic, renters need a broad eviction moratorium and emergency rental assistance to stay stably housed. There are other needs that we need to fix, though, to address the chronic shortage of affordable and available housing for the lowest income renters. That requires long-term commitments. Among other things, in addition to providing rental assistance for eligible households, a stabilization fund to help prevent evictions, and more legal protections for renters, we need to permanently address the shortage of affordable and available housing for the lowest income households. And that requires increasing the supply and properly preserving our affordable housing stock. On the next slide, I believe I have a little bit of information about what's available online. We have housing cost data for every state, metropolitan area, and county on our website. I would welcome you to take a look there at nlihc.org/OOR for our out of reach data, or /GAP for our GAP data. And the landing pages there both have maps where you can click through and find out more about the struggle of low-income renters in your area. I think I'll stop there.
Tim, you're not
I
on mute.
can't hear you.
Thank you, Dan, for that valuable information and for highlighting the issues and for specifically spotlighting those impacting the Southeastern Georgia. We do have some time for some Q&A. I believe there's a couple questions that have been sent directly to you, Dan. Do you see those? Hello?
Dan, you're on mute.
Thank you. I started reading the chat and forgot about the microphone. So at the top of the chat here, I see a question that asks whether slides will be made available. I don't know, Tim, if you have a plan to distribute that afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. Slides will be made available for every presentation, along with bios of the speakers, the recording for today's event directly after the event is over, or a couple of days after the event is over. In addition, we are recording this and we'll post it to Facebook as well.
Thanks. I see another question here in the chat that asks if there's a chart that shows how many earners are in the household. If there are 2 or 3 earners in the household, can they rent a 2-bedroom apartment? And I think this is a really great question. So the housing wage is a metric of how much someone can afford on one income. And we sometimes get questions, well, why don't we take account of 2 income earners? I think there is an question here. I'm sorry?
No, go ahead.
So in setting up the housing wage, we have to make a choice about how to model what it is that people can afford. And in 2018, in looking at the American Community Survey, I think we found that there were that 46% of renter households had just 1 adult. And so for a substantial portion of the renters across the country, we're really only talking about single income earners. Now, for households that have more than 1 adult, not all of those are 2 income earners. In fact, a lot of them are retired, or they have a disability, or they have family obligations that prevent them from being able to work full time. I think it's less than 24% of all renter households who have 2 adults who work at least 35 hours a week. So it's certainly the case that the housing wage will overestimate how much a minority of renters need to earn every hour in order to be able to afford their rent. But I do think it really highlights the struggle that many renter households are engaged in. I do have more information about this. We have a blog for the National Low Income Housing Coalition at hfront.org, I believe. And in September of last year, I wrote a few things that I can share with you. If you want to reach out to me at research@nlhc.org, I'm happy to supply more information about that. Tim, I don't know how much time we have. I'm happy to continue moving down the list if we do, though.
Yeah, we have a few more minutes, Dan, if there's a couple more questions. We have to about 1:15, so if there are a couple more questions you'd like to take.
Fantastic. Oh no, I actually don't think there is another here. It looks like Dr. Bambi Hayes-Brown had a question. I'm glad to see you're on the call, Dr. Hayes-Brown. Here's one. Have there been discussions surrounding the gentrification process and how to embed some controls to ensure that individuals are not priced out of affordable communities? That's a fantastic question, and I think would probably take far more time to do justice to than I would have here. We have talked about a variety of policies that could be targeted to help ensure that incumbent renters, that is, the renters who are already in the community, can stay in the community. And part of that, I think, a really important part of that is preserving the affordable housing stock in an area. So subsidized housing that allows renters to stay in their homes is an important part of that. There is mixed evidence when it comes to policies like rent control and rent stabilization about the extent to which that can help renters stay in their home. But of course, something like rent control or rent stabilization, while it might have at least a temporary impact on being able to slow displacement, has to be complemented with a supply side intervention in order to be able to make enough space for renters who want to move into the community and for renters who have to move at some point in their lives, either because their family grows or they need to move to the other side of the community to be closer to a job, so forth and so on. So we are talking about that because I think that is a really important question, particularly for housing organizations like the National Low Income Housing Coalition that are committed to redressing some of the substantial racial inequities that are a part of this problem.
See anything else, Dan?
I don't see any other questions in my feed here. I don't know if you do.
No, I don't see anything else. I think we've cleared them all out.
Well, fantastic. This has been a real pleasure, Tim. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Dan. This information has been terrific. Did a great job really laying out what the issues are. And I think it's really going to help us talk about, again, how houses of worship can play an important role in helping solve some of these issues. We will now take our first of 4 5-minute breaks. Following the break, we will open our first of 4 participant polls. We ask that you please be back at your computer at 1:20 p.m. So I'll give you a little bit more than 5 minutes. Thank you. Hello? Yeah, if I can remember that. Yeah. Okay. All right, Welcome back, everyone. There was a lot of data shared by Dan in his presentation, and we don't want you to get lost by it. But what it does point to is that there is a real issue and a crisis, and it's not going to fix itself. But before we continue with our program, we want to take a few moments to get a better idea of who has given up their time to be with us today. Thus, our first poll question are, when it comes to developing real estate as an option for houses of worship, what's your level of understanding? And secondly, what are your hopes in attending today's webinar? Please take a few moments to respond to the poll. Are you completely green? Have you some basic knowledge? Do you have a solid background? Or are you an expert? And are you here to learn new skills, to make new connections, to further perfect your virtual Zoom skills, or to better understand the development process? And you guys are responding. I'm looking at the numbers, and we're getting a lot of participation, but we can use some more. The poll is going to remain open for about another 30 or so seconds. We have 49 of 85 or 58%, 60% of people responding thus far. Please, if you're back from break, please answer the poll. Keep it up for another few seconds, see if we get any additional responses. All right, Shannon, I think you can close the poll and share the results. All right, for our first question, when it comes to developing real estate as an option for houses of worship, what is your level of understanding? It looks like we have the most people saying I have some basic knowledge, and only about 6% of people say they are an expert. So on that trajectory, you are either starting your journey, have some experience, or have a solid background. So we will have information during this event that will help you along that journey. As far as who we have in audience today, it looks like there's about 65% of people say to better understand the development process. Let me scroll up. And opportunities. Okay, well, we thank you for participating in the poll, and thank you again for being here. You can close the poll now. All right, I think the poll is coming down. All right. Now, we'll take an in-depth look at a very impressive example of a comprehensive development project completed by a faith-based organization, which will be moderated by a person representing an organization that has aspirations and a vision for doing similar work. With that, I would like to introduce Dawn Price, Executive Director of Zion Hill Community Development Corporation, who will introduce and moderate a discussion with our next presenter. Dawn?
Hi, can you hear me? Am I good?
Yep.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dawn Price, and like Tim said, I'm the Executive Director at Zion Hill CDC. We are faith-based located in East Point, Georgia. Enterprise asked that I moderate the faith-based development and case study panel today, as we are currently fully immersed in our own affordable housing project. And today we're going to hear from Ms. Veronica Harrison. She is the current Vice Chair of Israel Manor Inc.'s Board of Directors. In June of 2015, after 15 years of planning, that's commitment, 15 years of planning, development, and construction, Israel Baptist Church opened their newly constructed Community Life Center, which houses a multi-purpose event facility and a state-of-the-art ambulatory clinic. And less than a year later, they opened Visionary Square, a newly constructed 47-unit affordable housing complex for senior residents. So Ms. Harrison, please share with us how you define development, the role that houses of worship play in developing these projects, and how we can develop advocacy within the community for these much needed projects.
So thank you, Ms. Price. Let me just say this is an absolute honor to be here and to have been asked by our longtime partners, friends, brothers and sisters of Enterprise in the Mid-Atlantic region. And we're thrilled to see that the Faith-Based Development Initiative under the leadership of Tim is moving forward to make this a nationwide initiative. So congratulations to all of you all for even at the point you're at now, wherever you are, you're starting because you've embraced the vision. So that's the starting point. Your question is, how do I define development? And I think I appreciate that question because it's right aligned with what I have to share with you all today. I define development by having a vision and manifesting that vision in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, for the base of our entire community. So whatever we define as development is a function of our vision as a house of worship. So with that, if we can just move straight through the presentation, as you heard, this has been, or was at the time, it's even more years now, but at the time was a 15-year journey, and a journey it was. And nevertheless, I am going to distill that 15-year journey into a 15-minute conversation. So I'm always pleased to know that, you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So you're going to see a lot of pictures here and fewer words. What I've attempted to do here, again, is define that notion of what our development journey was in, I'll say, 5 categories. The first category is church engagement. The second category will be community advocacy. The third category will be financing, and fourth being project development. The fifth category that I will be addressing here is lessons learned. And that is probably the most important component of what I will address. What you see here first is our church engagement. And any vision from a house of worship has to have a champion. And it has to have a champion who lives, breathes, and will literally go to the bat with that vision. And we were fortunate enough to have had that visionary in the person of now the late Reverend Dr. Morris L. Sharon Sr., who was our pastor of Israel Baptist Church for over 29 years. Reverend Sharon came to Israel many, many, many years ago with a community development background and a passion for the people, a passion for the community. He engaged the church through a partnership. He viewed leadership of a community outreach was only accomplished by partnership, meaning he was never afraid to walk the community, meet the people, walk into houses. People would see him, children would see him. So he engaged in the means of making the house of worship a partnership within the community. Now, that did not come, as you will certainly see in the next couple of slides, without some sacrifices and without some pitfalls. But definitely, it's a leadership through partnership. We had to engage the church, our own church community had to buy into and embrace the vision because it could not be done with one voice. It could not be done with a few voices. The entire church had to be behind the vision. We needed to create a shared purpose, not it being the vision of a single person, but a vision of a body of Christ to carry out the work that was before us. We also, at the very reality base, at the end of the day, you got to have financial commitment. So, starting from a place of zero, basically, knowing that what our vision was later priced at a multi-million-dollar effort, we had to call upon the giving of our own church membership. So our church membership invested, if you will, in this vision. They trusted in the vision, though it was viewed as impossible, particularly in the Washington, D.C. area, and the ability to secure property and land in the Washington, D.C. area in and of itself was a challenge that was before us. So the congregation was committed through providing financial commitment well over $1 million in the early stages because they trusted in the vision and the resources that were provided, resources directly through our congregation, which ultimately turned into a separate entity, i.e. the Israel Manor Inc., which is a separate CDC, very similar to what Ms. Price, I heard you say with Zion Hill, a separate CDC that could be focused on the business aspects of bringing the vision to fruition, maintaining liaison and partnership with the church as the founding visionary organization. So it was a very, very close-knit relationship. The Israel Manor Inc. CDC was built, established, integrated, taxed, received our tax status so that we could begin to move forward with what we needed to do. And this was all based on a strategy of faith in knowing that the impossible would be possible. And while it was a strategy of faith, it was based on leveraging, and this is not to be taken lightly, we had to leverage having had a prior success. Because no matter how passionate you are about your vision, when it comes down to securing millions of dollars, securing community support, you have to be able to demonstrate that you're capable and you have the capacity and you have the resources not to simply start a project, but to see it through to the end. So having recently retired a $4 million mortgage on our sanctuary in the course of 4 years, we used and leveraged that success. So find a success story, no matter how significant or insignificant you may view it. Find a success story, build on that success story, and carry that success story forward to make your case that you are, in fact, committed to a new initiative. So that's church engagement. You see there the actual facility that's in the upper right-hand corner. That is our New Life Israel, or the Reverend Morris L. Sharon Sr. Community Life Center. It is appended to the sanctuary of the church that you see on the upper right-hand corner. You can go to the next slide. I mentioned community advocacy, development. The success of development is a team sport, and it's a community affair. It cannot be done within the four walls of your house of worship. As soon as you believe that you can make it happen by yourself, you're doomed to failure. You have to step out in the community. The first bullet point there, it's not easy, but it is crucial to your success and to sustainability. You must consider your local officials as well as those influential community voices that don't necessarily have a title behind their names, but perhaps have been within your community for multi-generations. and people listen to that one small voice who lives down the street on the corner. So you need to understand who is in your community, develop a critical mass of support, help the community see the win-win in it for them. Maintain transparency every step of the way. When you do this, not only will you find that issues as they arise become easier to resolve, but you will also be able to build your church, because this community advocacy is also can also be an evangelistic initiative simultaneously. So transparency, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Don't just share the good news. You need to share your failures. You need to share your challenges so that the community can understand that you are in this for the long haul and that you are committed to this being a collective success, which is exactly the end of that slide. Share your victories. These are victories of the community that happen to be hosted. I like to use that word, hosted by the house of worship, but led by the community. So language and how you position yourselves in the community is important. You see there in the pictures, we have the Congresswoman, Helena Holmes Norton, who was there, down to persons that happened to live in the house on the corner, who participated in the ribbon cutting ceremony for our Community Life Center. Next slide. Project development and financing requires commitment of the heart, the head, and the hands. You will see on a subsequent slide the journey we went through here. I'm going to run through these really quickly. What you see here, as Mr. Block indicated, this was really a two-pronged project. Not only were we attempting to build a 42,000 square foot community life center, but simultaneously we had two projects happening, which also included a 47-unit affordable housing complex for seniors in the city. Each of these facilities are about a block apart, maybe 2 blocks apart from each other. And our idea was that not only are we building community by bringing our seniors into not just affordable housing, but progressive, high quality affordable housing in one of the most highly economic and highly developed places within the city. We were told that this was going to be an impossible undertaking. And that just made it all the sweeter when we were able to bring 60 residents into our affordable housing unit who could walk to Unity Healthcare, which is the organization that leases 2 floors of our Community Life Center. So our mantra is that we are serving the mind, the body, and the soul as a part of these joint programs. It's a project of Israel Baptist Church and Israel Manor Inc. as the CDC. Our development representative was District Development Group and IDS Homes. The architects were A2, our general contractor and builder, Forrester Construction. Our financing structure, which there's not enough time on any one of these calls to discuss the most complex financing structure I have ever experienced, and I believe will ever experience in my life to come. It was a 3-pronged financing structure for this facility, which included public debt through our local Department of Housing and Community Development organization, private debt, as well as equity-based financing using New Markets tax credits. And that was offered through US Bank. And then there were public grants that supported the health organization of the build out of their portion of the space. So the next slide speaks to our affordable housing. Remember, these projects were on parallel paths with a group of less than 10 board of directors who never once had a degree in real estate, commercial financing, construction. We were members of the church who had business skills in various ways. So what you see here is that while it was the project of Israel Baptist Church in Israel Manor, we had to call in experts. So for our housing, we had Mission First Housing Development, as well as a partnership with the Henson Development Company. Our architect was Bryant Mitchell. Our general contractor was Hamill Builders, which is a huge affordable housing builder in the Washington metropolitan area. Our financing structure on this project was equally as complex. It was a combination as well of public debt, private debt, low-income housing tax credit on an equity basis. This is one that we are so very privileged to have had the support of our partners of Enterprise. So for those of you who are new to the Enterprise Community Partnership, please, 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 ma'am, please, sir, take advantage of the technical support and the advocacy that Enterprise runs deep and their resources stretch wide. Take advantage of the support that is offered through Enterprise. Had it not been for Enterprise, and I can say this with all confidence, we would not have been able to start this project by securing the site, securing the land. That was a story in and of itself, but Enterprise came to the rescue. So because of Enterprise and the support we received from the Faith-Based Development Initiative, we were able to move through the pre-development efforts of this project and actually went from ideation to construction in 3 years. That brings me to lessons learned. Now, I know I just kind of ran through 2 major projects very quickly here. Lessons learned. I put a chart there. I don't expect that you'll be able to read. I really just wanted to show this is a portion of the journey. You see the red, the yellow, and the green. That's because as it related to our Community Life Center, we had to learn lessons that we were able to translate into the affordable housing. We learned a lot of lessons in that first project that we were able to manifest in doing things differently in the affordable housing. You see, we vacillated. Was it going to be a 50,000 square foot building? No, it went up to 63,000 foot for a minute, and then it went back down to 42,000 foot. We were all over the place. We went through about 3 architects. We went through about 2 development firms. So the story there, the moral to that story is be firm, be clear, and be humble enough to know when the persons or person that you have engaged to assist you don't necessarily embrace the vision the way you do. And when it's time to part ways, you may have to do that. Do not see that as a failure. See that as a lesson learned to be able to move forward. So you must promote the vision. You must cultivate those relationships with the local government, community development agencies, community leaders, residents, and private partners. We would never have been able to bring to fruition the vision of a community health center, a multi-purpose event center, and affordable housing had it not been for partnerships that were cultivated from our leader and our pastor, Reverend Sharon. You must engage qualified experts. No matter the number of volunteers you have, church members who want to be a part of it, there is a place for everyone in the development. but not everyone needs to be in the right place at that time. So make certain that you do create opportunities for your membership of your house of worship to participate in the effort along the way, but also be certain that you have experts guiding you every step of the way. That means experts that you may not even think about at the beginning. You know, I say this, and there's a story behind this if we ever get to chat offline, but who knew we would need a historical cemetery expert when we broke ground on our affordable housing complex to find that our ground was previously a historical African American cemetery, but still had remains. So our project stopped, and praise be to God that it was a house of worship that sought to build on that land, because we in turn were able to care for those remains that were still there in a dignified and spiritual fashion. But we had to put our housing project on hold because that was the assignment for us to do. So be flexible, have experts on board to help guide you every step of the way, commit skilled resources for project management, not just the general contractors that you employ, but have someone who's within your house of worship. Have someone who understands, lives and breathes the vision as you are, ensuring that they're skilled to help project manage that. Expect the unexpected. Best laid plans are just that, plans. Be prepared, be flexible, be steadfast. Be steadfast, because if God brings you to it, He's going to bring you through it. And there's lots of stories to go behind that support. And then strategically plan. You know, I'm a firm believer. You begin with the end in mind. You start off thinking about how are you going to sustain it after the ribbon cutting is done, after the excitement goes away, after the groundbreaking and the excitement of the galas go away. What is your plan to sustain your presence in the community, to ensure that the community is in fact seeing the benefits that were promised to them, and to maintain those relationships throughout the process? So that's my story in 10 words or less. And I'd rather hear questions that you all have as opposed to just kind of talking through everything here.
Perfect. Well, I would like to first say thank you for that. It was a great presentation, very informative. And I will say this, most days I'm pulling my hair out. You have such a calming spirit. I'm just going to have to call you every day to talk me off that ledge, because you just are very calming. So I appreciate that. So we do have several questions. So I think Shannon is going to send them to the two of us, but I know I can see one already from Michael Bryant, and he wants a little bit more clarity around private debt. And it says, are you speaking to the finances of the church or the finances of the member of the board, the members of the board specifically? In essence, does the FICO score of the individual members of your board or governance factor into the financing?
Okay, I'm gonna, that's a lot in there, but I'm gonna give you sort of the Cliff's Notes response to that. When you use the term private debt in our local jurisdiction, that's essentially saying it is through a banking institution. It is not private, meaning individual persons, meaning that you're going to a standard banking institution and you are securing a loan through a bank as would be any commercial loan. It is not through a public entity, through CDBG funds, through HUD. It's not through government funds. It is private industry funds, in this case, private banking financial institutions, versus public debt, which is considered debt and loans that would be coming from a local government agency. So that's the private debt piece of it.
So another question is, who actually owns the project?
Israel Manor Inc., the CDC.
Okay.
So I saw on the back part of that original question, and it was in the chat, I see now.
Mhm.
The FICO score of individual members. Let me just also add, we created a CDC, a Community Development Corporation, as a separate independent 501c3 organization for the sole purpose of insulating the house of worship. So while the name and the underlying of Israel Baptist Church continues as the founding entity, there is no legal liability of the house of worship. The legal liability is associated with the CDC. So should anything happen as a part of the project, the church is always insulated from any legal actions. So I did want to get to that. Our board of governance of the CDC, it is a volunteer membership. It is a volunteer with a set of bylaws, articles of incorporation, et cetera. So there's no FICO scores or compensation of sorts that deal with our board. Who actually owns the project, as I mentioned, is Israel Manor Inc. It's the CDC.
So the other one is, do you have
Exception of the affordable housing. The
Mhm.
affordable housing, right now, under the low-income housing tax credit, because low-income housing tax credit has a 15-year syndication period. So right now, the partnership, because we created that project as a separate, another separate entity. Israel Senior Residence is a legal entity that is there specifically to have legal ownership of the affordable housing. It is an entity on paper. It is an entity on paper that is owned partially between Israel Manor Inc., Mission First Housing Development Corporation, and the syndicator of the low-income housing tax credits. Once that period ends, ownership will revert back to the developer, who was Israel Manor Inc.
There's a question around rent subsidies for the affordable housing. Do you have them? And what is the source?
Yes, so the low-income housing tax credit process is a process through HUD where the rent payments that tenants actually pay out of pocket are substantially subsidized based on the tenant's AGI.
Mhm.
It is substantially subsidized, and it's through the low-income housing tax credit program, which is a HUD-based program.
So there's some in the chat. I know there was a question.
Oh, I do see a great question here. I'm seeing the A part of the question. I haven't read the original question, but it says, were you ever sued by subcontractors?
That's where I was going.
Okay, we were not sued by subcontractors, but we were sued by a resident.
Okay.
And just know, in Washington, D.C., in Washington, D.C. in particular, anyone can sue you for anything at any time, period. That's just the law in Washington, D.C. So if someone didn't like the fact that I wear glasses, they could file a suit in civil court that says, I don't like the way that she wears glasses. So you're placed in a position where you're going to have to potentially respond no matter how frivolous the lawsuits are. But no, we were not sued by any subcontractors. And you want to ensure when you are writing your contracts with your general contractor, because you as a house of worship and or CDC are engaging in a contract with the general contractor. The general contractor owns liability where any subcontractors that come on board. So you always want to keep your entity separate and ensure that you are not specifically engaging subcontractors outside of your general contractor, who is the bonded, insured, liable individual or entity.
The other question is, does the additional 501c3 dissolve subsequent to the completion of the development, or does it continue to manage the project, in its purpose and scope?
The latter. We are a business at this point, even though our board has shrunk as well, but which is one reason that I am still on the board at this point, because sustainability, again, once the project is done, that's when the work really starts. You need to operate the program, you need to staff the CDC because there are all kinds of compliance requirements. You cannot begin to imagine. We have property management. We had to hire property management companies to ensure that the day-to-day operations of our housing project. So they have maintenance, and you have tenants that you have to collect rent, and all of that. You become a business. So yes, we are an operating organization with a $42 million asset portfolio that we are responsible for.
And then, so there's lots of comments and everyone's just saying, excellent presentation, you've done a great job. They're just so impressed with the work that you guys are doing. Another one is informing you that you have nice glasses, so no one should sue you for the glasses.
I will not be sued. Praise God for that.
So I have a question. Are you guys planning any future projects? Do you have any other housing on the agenda?
We actually had conversations with our faith-based development team here to begin to start ideating. We have currently a tiny, really bizarre structured piece of land. It's the equivalent of a slice of pie, if you think about it. It's the equivalent of a slice of pie that sits between two residential homes right now. And we're trying to figure out, what are we going to do with this piece of land? Because of course, as long as it's undeveloped, it's subject to taxes. So we're paying property taxes on an undeveloped piece of land. And we're calling upon Enterprise to, as thought partners right now, to just begin to think about, when we're considering based on our mission. We always make decisions based on what our mission is, what the mission of our founding church is, and we partner. And we're right now thinking about different types, maybe a small, multi-unit apartment building that might be 3 or 4 apartments for either veterans or a marginalized group in the low-income housing arena. But we're trying to think about that. We have just gone through. Right now, we're not ready, and I will be, in the interest of full transparency, I will be very clear. We don't have the capacity right now to take on a major project because our hands are full. Remember, this is a volunteer board of directors, many of which have real jobs for a living. And we have a very tiny staff of like 4 or 5 people who are attempting to run this $45 million portfolio. We also, as I shared earlier, I said the late Reverend Dr. Morris L. Sharon. So our house of worship, within the last 3 years, we lost our visionary. I get a little emotion, I'm sorry. We lost him and had an interim pastor, and we actually lost our interim pastor who transitioned to glory last year. And we have a elected pastor. We have a new pastor, praise God. He sent us a man of God, and he was with us for 1 week before we went into COVID shutdown. So we are at a place right now where the church is kind of just trying to get its land legs and to get itself re-established and restabilized, and to really get an opportunity to engage with our new shepherd to see what is the philosophy and what is the vision of our new shepherd. So while we are continuing to have thought partners, to have plans ready to lock and load, if you will, we're not ready to jump jump into it just yet because we have to be honest with ourselves in terms of our own capacity to be able to take something else on right now.
Well, thank you, and I'm sorry for the losses of the church, and I know that you all are.
It's been a rough couple of
valued
years here. It
Oh,
really has
yes.
been.
And then you throw a pandemic on top of all of that, so
Exactly.
it's been tough all around. But thank you. I think our time is up, so I'm trying to honor the agenda, and thank you so much. And I certainly will be reaching out to you. I think you're a fountain of information, and we appreciate all the work that you're doing in the community. And certainly serving the seniors in DC. It warms my heart. That's part of the population that we serve. And so I appreciate it. It's always great to talk to people who are like-minded and doing the same work, because oftentimes you feel like you're in the boat by yourself. And so it's always great to see that there are others that are just kind of experiencing the same challenges and have the same level of passion. So thank you for all the work that you do.
And please do feel free to share if there are any questions that come up in the remainder of the session that can be directed. Please feel free. Tim has all of my contact information, and we'd be happy to respond back to any questions. Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Don and Veronica. What an amazing presentation. You both inspired me with your examples of putting faith into action. And Veronica, Enterprise could not have written a better commercial for our work in the FBDI. Thank you for the plug. But also thank you for emphasizing the importance of partners with expertise, whether it be Enterprise or others. We will now take another 5-minute break. Following the break, we'll open up our second participant poll. We ask that you please be back at 2:05. Thank you. Welcome back. To get us ready for our next presenters who will be discussing affordable housing through a health equity lens, we want to ask in our next poll, which of these historical events have led to ongoing housing and health disparities? Redlining, the GI Bill, zoning, or all of the above? We're getting some great responses, but we're only about 42% of participants on the call. All right, we're at 65%. Give it a few more seconds. We're at about close to 80% of participants responding. Okay, Shannon, you can show the results. You're ahead of me. All right, so 84% of people believe it is all of the above. So with that, I am not going to tell you the answer. I am going to let our next presenters do that. Shannon, you can go ahead and take the poll down, please. All right. Our next presenters are Christy Durazo, National Director of Health Equity Strategies with the American Heart Association, and Mary Ayala, Senior Program Director, Health Begins with Home here at Enterprise. They will discuss the connection between structural racism, housing, and health. Christy and Mary, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Tim. We appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today. And admittedly, when we started planning for these workshops over a year ago, we hope to be there in person. We continue to work toward that, and hopefully that'll be at the groundbreaking of one of your great projects that are created from this initiative. In our partnership with Enterprise, we've always believed that there was huge, huge opportunity in housing and housing in the Southeast in particular. And we're grateful for the engagement and the power of the faith community to expand previous partnerships. We've worked with the faith community in our Empowered to Serve and Empowered and Well programs, but we think housing offers that feet on the ground, actionable activities that can directly benefit our communities. So you may be asking, why health and housing? Kimberly set that up early on, but the reality is that AHA has been interested in this housing and social determinants of health space for some time. In 2015, the AHA and our Chief Medical Officer, Eduardo Sanchez, provided the introductory opening remarks for the Green Build Cities criteria that Enterprise introduced, really focusing on sustainability of housing, bringing health into the housing equation. And so that same year, we also, from a scientific perspective, being a science-based organization, created a scientific statement on social determinants of health, stating without addressing factors outside a clinical setting, which is normally where we operate, that we would not be effective at reducing the burden of disease and improving the well-being of all members of our society. And so as we move forward, in November of 2020, we also released a paper on the health impact of structural racism and the role that plays in our health. And so housing, again, was called out separately, and we relied on a scientific statement that came out in July of 2020 on the relationship between health, housing, and hope, the neighborhood quality, and what that brings to our overall cardiovascular health, our brain health, our overall well-being, and our quality of life. So we're very excited to be here today, and we look forward to taking this journey with you and answering any questions that you might have about our engagement. Next slide. So the AHA's 2024 impact goal really pulls out the fact that we want an equitable solution to getting rid of health disparities, that everyone deserves an opportunity for a hopeful and healthy life. champions for health equity. As the AHA, we want to make sure that we're partnering with everyone who is in the fold. And I think the previous speakers alluded to the fact that none of us are in this alone, and that if we can be transparent and if we can come together, that all of us bring to the table various assets that can be made to identify and remove barriers for health and healthcare. We specifically call out that addressing the drivers of health disparity, including social determinants of health and structural racism, is the only way that we can truly bring health and well-being for all. And so while we have a wonderful set of scientists and researchers who are looking at cardiovascular health and can put in a stent or can give you a high blood pressure medication, we also are engaging scientists outside of the cardiovascular and neurology professions to help us look at the social psychological well-being of our communities. And so we're really excited to have this conversation today. Next slide. Our journey, and so you can kind of get an idea of how an organization like an American Heart Association moves forward into this 2020-2021 era. We started out almost 100 years ago in 1924, and we were really focused on bringing public and professional provider education. And so with the limited knowledge that we had of this time, we really focused on being that trusted source of information so that providers could provide better treatment to their patients, the public could know more about their conditions and how to prevent disease as we knew it in 1924. So in 1971, as new treatment methodologies became available, as we learned that the best treatment for a heart attack wasn't bed rest for the rest of a person's life, we began developing technologies that allowed us to enter this acute care phase. And so no longer did you have to die or be permanently disabled from a heart attack. With medications and surgical interventions, survivability began to increase geometrically and has since the 1970s because of medical and pharmaceutical interventions. But that led us to a condition in the 2010 era where we found that those progress markers that we'd been watching since the early 1970s were starting to decline. And in the spirit of health equity and health disparity, they were declining a lot more for communities of color, for communities experiencing disability, for communities of low socioeconomic status. And so we really started focusing in on risk factors and thinking about obesity and blood pressure and how can we keep all of those factors under control so that you don't ever have that acute event. And then evolving into 2015 and the time period I was just talking about in our relationship with Enterprise and the paper on social determinants of health, we realized that people present in a clinical setting already having a whole history of issues, whether that's been racism that they've experienced, whether that's been housing segregation experience, educational opportunities, economic issues that was discussed by the first speaker. All of those things create toxic stress, which is just as much a risk factor as blood pressure. And so by beginning to look at social determinants of health in their entirety, we started to identify ways that intervention prior to someone entering the clinical setting was very, very important. And we think that housing is one of those most important interventions. Housing itself, but housing also is a platform from which stable services can be delivered, whether that's food security, whether that's education, whether that's safety from a criminal environment, that all of those factors are so very, very important. And then finally, in 2020, November of 2020, we issued our statement that was years in the making. It wasn't simply because of the events that had happened over the summer. That structural racism in and of itself, the history, the legacy systems, the institutional practices, of which redlining, the GI Bill, zoning regulations, banking practices, all of which had become cumulative to create this crisis of health and creating massive health disparities between the wealthier populations and white populations and communities of color or lower SES populations. So that's our scientific journey, all in an evidence-based way. And we're very excited to be having conversations in this space. Next slide. So I will refer you to, and I'll drop into the chat box after I'm finished speaking, our actual paper on structural racism as a driver of health disparities and the call to action, in which we're holding ourselves accountable as well as the profession as a whole accountable to begin addressing this. Not just within those four walls, not just diversifying the pipeline of clinicians that you may see, but thinking about health more holistically and looking at all those other structural drivers and how do we dismantle those drivers that have occurred over the last 400 years. Next slide. I also refer to the scientific statement, again, being evidence-based organization, on the importance of housing and cardiovascular health and overall well-being, and how your neighborhood quality and how the quality of your housing and how the safety of your housing is all so important in you being able to live your highest and best life. Next slide. So we know that history is past, but it is all present. And discriminatory laws from the Indian Removal Act, the GI Bill that was given to white returning soldiers, not to soldiers of color, the federal practices of redlining that we're going to talk a lot more about, they were all enacted and ensured that people who were American Indian, Black, or Hispanic were denied home ownership and quality affordable housing. And that's still manifest to this day. There's a great article out right now by that NPR highlights that where we had redlining practices in 1930s and 1940s, we still have generational health disparities even 70, 80, 90 years later. So those legacy practices live on. And as I say, he who doesn't learn from history is doomed to repeat its mistakes. In this instance, to be able to get rid of those structural barriers, we have to know the history and where they started from. So this whole issue of housing insecurity that our first speaker talked about, overcrowding, concentrated poverty, these are all manifestations of those historical practices and keeping historically marginalized communities continually marginalized. Next slide. So these are some maps of redlining in the Atlanta area. The areas that you see shaded in red were literally redlined by major banking institutions. And they said that those areas were too risky to lend in, and that areas that were yellow were slightly risky, but better, and that blue and green areas were okay to live in. And if you think about your knowledge of the Atlanta market, you know that basically continues to align with areas of lower concentrations of poverty today. And the really cool little color diagram on the left talks about the mobility and where those neighborhoods have gone over time. And you'll notice that there are very, very few areas that were redlined that made it up into a blue or a green tier. And so again, practices that are 70 years old are continuing to impact our neighborhoods today. Next slide. And that's resulted in a wealth gap. If you think about where Americans put their wealth, it's normally in their house or their 401k. If you work in a job that doesn't offer a 401k plan, you're not earning any wealth in terms of your retirement income. And if you were denied housing or put into lower appraisal district housing, you are not accumulating wealth at the same rate. And so this depicts over time, since the 1960s, how those lending practices and zoning practices and the availability of a GI Bill for education and some mortgage benefits that went to white individuals have manifested in this major wealth disparity over time. And this is just an average rate. It doesn't impact the whole 1%, 99%, and it's even a greater difference there. So the wealth gap enables you to start a business, it enables you to have an education, it enables you to take more risk in your planning portfolios. And so that wealth gap is a substantial barrier, structural barrier for ongoing productivity and positive health outcomes. Next slide. So how does that affect us today? This is a great map, and there's a whole series of them, of maps through communities across the Southeast and across the United States. You see that areas that were green lined have a life expectancy of 84 years, whereas areas that were red lined, the life expectancy is 71, 72 years. And so there's great documentation, great evidence that all those practices, whether it be air pollution or absolute value of educational attainment or job access or transportation access, all are contributing to these poor health outcomes today. Next slide. And this is an example of redlining and health outcomes looking at air quality. These examples happen to be in California, but the areas that were redlined, again, the maps across the top, almost exactly overlay with the poor air pollution, which we know manifests in poor health outcomes in each of those communities. So it's almost a legacy you can't escape without some type of an intervention. And we happen to think that housing and investment in individuals' welfare is the way of breaking that cycle. Next slide. Something we often don't think about in terms of how health is manifest, on the next slide, please. Yes, is heat islands. And so think about in the sweltering summers, and my grandparents' family is from Louisiana, so I can attest to having to spend sweltering summers in the Southeast. The heat islands tend to be manifest more significantly in areas that had been redlined than in areas that were green line. And so specifically pointing out here, Jackson, Chattanooga, Atlanta, Charlotte have a disproportionate burden of heat in areas that are lower socioeconomic status, areas that were formerly redlined, and areas that are primarily communities of color. So this ongoing legacy is such an important part of what we seek through this faith-based initiative to break the cycle of and to create a common mission around improving the health, the well-being, and the housing quality that our communities deserve. Next slide. So the same thing holds true with the redlining and how it manifests today in food deserts. So they call it supermarket redlining. And again, looking at Atlanta and where there are supermarket deserts and food deserts. So you can see that, again, the legacy practices. So when someone says, but that was in 1938, you need to get over it. I think that we need to have the story ready to tell that there's no way that an individual can individually pull themselves up by their bootstraps and overcome these huge systemic issues that we've created as a society. And I'm going to drop my comments now and refer it over to Mary, who I think is going to talk about even more currently how these same issues are manifesting in the COVID crisis. So Mary?
Yes, thanks, Christy, and thank you for everything that you shared. I think exactly as you mentioned, I'm just going to pick up where you kind of left off with how these things are continuing, or how these patterns that are very place-based are moving into the COVID crisis. And I'm just going to wait for the slides. There we go. All right. And just a step back a minute, I think, just to introduce myself, I'm Mary Ayala. I'm a senior program director with Enterprise. I've been with Enterprise for about 4.5 years and previously worked in the healthcare sector prior to coming to Enterprise, where we've really taken a national focus on how we can work more closely as a housing sector with healthcare sector partners to address the disparities that we are talking about today. So because of the historic and current systemic racism that Christy just spoke about, we are seeing that people of color are being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. I'm sure that this is not news to most of you all, but I did want to lift up a recent finding that came out of the National Academy of Science that was lifted up in relation to this. And it really illustrates how much more communities of color have experienced the burden of COVID-19 through morbidity and mortality because of the structural inequities that exist in the US. And this was that a lot of what Christy was just referring to in the forms of maps that she was sharing was the Black-white life expectancy gap that exists between races in the United States. This kind of is illustrated oftentimes through those place-based maps at the neighborhood level. Because we're such a segregated society, they tie very closely to the Black-white life expectancy gap that we see. So nationally, there's a 3.6-year life expectancy gap prior to COVID-19. And in 2020, that 3.6-year gap grew to over a 5-year gap due to the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And so we can go to the next slide. And I promise that this is the last database slide that you'll have to see during our presentation, I think, because I know that these are hard to hear and that much of this you may already be aware of. But at this time, we've seen about 15.6% of the United States population being vaccinated. And as we move towards more vaccinations, we are seeing that in states that are reporting back data by vaccination by race, we are seeing that white people are receiving vaccinations in large part at a higher rate than their proportion of the population. And I think it's important to note that even if their vaccination rate was proportional to their population, that would just imply that we were vaccinating equally in the United States, but it wouldn't speak to the equitable distribution of vaccines at all. And given what we've mentioned in the first part of the presentation, and then the impact of COVID in terms of disease burden not being equally distributed across populations in this country, we really need to think about an equitable vaccine rollout and an equitable response to these problems. So I think it's important to note that back in December, there was a review of all of the state-based vaccine rollout plans. And at that time, only one state, which was Montana, actually included and called out people of color or American Indians as specific populations to that were at increased risk of COVID-19 and would be targeted for vaccination earlier on. So I will note that there is no prioritization for vaccine distribution to communities of color in the Center for Disease Control's recommendations for phase 1. And that was released back in December under the previous administration, and many states chose to adopt those recommendations. So I think that it's important to just note that as we ask for equity within our public health response and within the work that we do, these things have to be clearly stated at multiple levels, and that it's going to have to be a big culture shift and a multifaceted approach. So y'all may have seen headlines out there that even when clinics around vaccines are being set up in New York City, I think was getting a lot of press around this. So they were setting up vaccine sites in communities of color, and they were actually seeing that a lot of folks from other parts of New York, like more white people, were coming into those communities to get vaccinated because they had better access to the appointments and the system. And so I just think it's important to note that we have to think about access, we have to think about cost, communication and outreach, and a targeted focus on racial equity in these plans. So I'm going to try to take us back to housing now. And I invite us all, as we move to the next slide, to really take a breath. And I feel like these slides are hard to take in, even if you have heard these statistics before. I think it's important for us all to take a moment and really acknowledge that these patterns are not okay and that they're rooted in real lives, and that I just think it's good to take that moment before we move to solutions. So I invite everyone to do that. All right. So I think the rest of this presentation will hopefully move us towards hope, that last word in the title of this presentation. And I do have a lot of hope that we are at a unique moment right now as a country, and that I think before I get into that, I'll just share a little bit that back in college, I remember I was once taking a chemistry class, a biology class, and a history class that was focused on religion. And I was having this light bulb moment where I was taking things from my chemistry class and they were starting to connect into my biology class. And then you started to see these things that we consider modern science integrated into different stories from religion and things like that. And all of a sudden, it was this moment in time that I felt like my education was becoming more holistic, where I was seeing the interconnectedness of all of these issues that I was learning about in school. And I think that once you have that light bulb moment, it helps you move forward and see the interconnectedness of work and outcomes over time. And so I would say that there are a lot of light bulbs going off right now as our country is facing a climate crisis, renewed kind of focus on social and racial justice, and we're combating a pandemic that goes along with an economic crisis. So these are all huge things for us to be combating at once, but I think it provides us this opportunity to really step back, see how connected everything is, and that we have to work through these solutions together. And I just wanted to lift up a couple of examples. The top piece of the slide is around the White House's kind of 5 priorities right now that they're prioritizing: the pandemic, and within that, the need for substantial economic relief. And I think we all know that in many cases, that's a drive to keep people housed as well. A focus on climate and a commitment to racial equity. And I think that there are solutions that can hit on all 5 of those. And a lot of those are rooted in housing as well. And the bottom brief that you see there is actually from the Center for Disease Control that released a declaration that evictions of tenants could be detrimental to public health. And that's really big. It might not seem big, it might seem like things that we all already knew, but it's very big for our nation's federal public health entity to make a statement on housing. They don't have a lot of guidance right now. I think there's support from the community guide that like permanent supportive housing is a public health solution and a few other smaller things, but it is a very big deal for the CDC to come out and say this statement. And so we're in this unique moment. And the question I think is can we do things differently? Because we know we have to. And at Enterprise, we really see housing as a core piece of this solution. So if we wanted to move to the next slide, as housing is a core piece of this solution, last fall, Enterprise, with the support of City, hosted a 3-part series on health and housing. And I'm going to, in the next few slides, just lift up a couple of learnings that came out of this event series, because we were lucky enough to have great speakers come in and share their thoughts and examples with us. And so we kicked off the series with a keynote address from Dr. Tiffany Manuel, who started The Case Made. I'd encourage all of y'all to go check out her website. She also has a book, and she really speaks to how, I'm sorry, I'm echoing, but I'll keep going. Do others hear that? Okay. Hopefully we can get rid of the echo, but all right, I was just saying that Dr. Tiffany Manuel lifted up 3 important things that speak to how we can work differently moving forward. And those elements are that as we form cross-sector partnerships, we should, so as we form partnerships between community development and the healthcare sector, which is what I've been focused on, but I think it extends beyond that to these larger partnerships we've been talking about today, that we have to ensure that rooted within these partnerships, we have an understanding of history and the context of the communities that we're serving, that we need to work with the community to engage them around the vision that they have for themselves, and then build agency within the community to work in partnership with cross-sector partners who are tackling these interconnected issues. So if we want to move on to the next slide, I think that we could all probably acknowledge there's lots of work we could do across all 3 of those. And it's hard to get it right, and it takes a lot of work. But I want to just highlight 3 examples of solutions that are starting to tackle one or more of those points. So to start off with Providence St. Joseph's Health, they're a health system that spans multiple states, not including Georgia, unfortunately, but we were able to hear from Dana Barilla, who is the executive leader of community investment for their health system. And she shared a lot about how they are a large health system, but they're building a strategy to combat housing and homelessness across their 7 states, that instead of being top down is bottom up. They're very focused on local needs and local partnerships. And so this kind of translates into them focusing at the local level on the specific needs and context within the communities that their hospitals are in. And they do this in part through identifying those needs through community health needs assessment and heavy engagement from the community within those, and also relying on local partnerships and local organizations to really support them in their work to end homelessness within their community. And sorry, I don't have time to go into too much detail on all of these. I'm just going to try to briefly speak to each one. So I hope that folks have had the chance to maybe hear about the Greensboro Housing Coalition. They're doing great work up in North Carolina, and they were actually developed out of needs that were in the community and from the community. They're an advocacy organization that supports residents around many of their housing needs. But one particular area is really targeting respiratory illness that's exacerbated by substandard rental housing conditions. So if you're thinking mold or pest and things along those lines, that's some of what they're really targeting there. And they work directly with community members to understand the needs that they have within the housing that they can help support getting improvements around. And they actually also work with the community groups to empower them and help them push for the change that they want to see in their housing and in their community. And then a last element of this that I thought was really interesting is they're starting to form cross-sector partnerships with healthcare, and that they actually have Greensboro Housing Coalition members going into the hospitals that they're working with and teaching residents about redlining and why they're seeing the impacts of asthma really concentrated within certain communities within Greensboro. And so I thought that was really interesting and will hopefully lead to very powerful change in the way that physicians even approach the problem with the people who they are seeing. And then the last one that I want to touch on, I'm a little biased about, but I had to get one in there that I'm a part of, is the enterprise-led initiative called the Health Action Plan. And this is an initiative where we've tried to connect community voice with investments that are being made by healthcare into housing. And it's actually driven by an investment from Kaiser Permanente into what we're calling our Housing for Health Equity Fund, which targets the preservation of affordable units in the Bay Area. And when I say equity in that case, we're actually talking about equity within buildings, just for clarification. And within this work, each developer that is participating in the fund works with their residents and a public health professional to identify priority health needs that exist within their resident population and surrounding community, to develop different strategies that they can have to address the prioritized health needs. And so it's a process that ultimately the developer kind of makes the final decision on what they can afford to do and what is feasible for them within their scope. However, the residents inform each stage of prioritizing the health issues and suggesting the strategies that they would be interested in seeing. So it's we're learning a lot through this partnership and something that we hope to grow. So we can go to the last slide. As I wrap up, given where this country is, I strangely feel like I have a lot of hope for where we are going and our ability to work together and work towards a more equitable future, because I really think we have to. So I am going to leave you with a quote that came from Josie Williams, who is the executive director of the Greensboro Housing Coalition. And her quote is just that her vision of the future is when everyone takes the needs and issues of equity in this country as personal, because this is personal work, and we should not accept a world where your zip code is predictive of your health. I'm going to end there. I see a couple of questions coming through as well. All right, Christy, can you see the questions as well? I can just go ahead and maybe state the first one. We had one question come through that was, can we connect the dots between congregations, neighborhoods, and health? How can a development be sure to reach the community that is not a member of their congregation through health partnership?
That's a great question. And fortunately, with the auto magic of geomapping, we can do that. So we can identify down to the census tract level where the greatest needs are, to the zip code level, if that's a better measurement, and do that for a community, a population. Even in some rural areas, that data set exists. So yes, that can be done. And sometimes there's an overlap of where that need is. Sometimes it's across town, or it may even be 2 communities over, as we were learning in Kentucky, that certain rural communities needed help more than others. So yes, that technology does exist, and we can work with that. And Enterprise actually has a great tool called Opportunity 360 that looks at all of the attributes, not just the housing issues, but the food security issues, the grocery redlining issue, and we often use that tool as well.
Great. And just to add to that, Christy, the Opportunity 360 tool is at the census tract level, which is really neat and something that I think you don't often see. So that might be particularly helpful for these relationships. And I think that's a great question too, because just knowing that if you're getting into community development, that is going to impact the full community and not just your congregation. So I am no expert in terms of these partnerships, but I will say from the health perspective, it is very important to go through that community engagement phase and maybe serve as a hub within the community to offer that opportunity for input into what is being developed and what types of services and other aspects are going to be provided. We do have, I think, through Enterprise Community Development, an affordable housing development that almost serves that role within their community. It's a senior housing development, and they've kind of created a variety of different spaces within the building that allow community members to come in and work with the seniors and participate in the different kind of clubs and things like that the seniors have developed for themselves. And I think the rule was that the resident services head would say she would create a program as long as 5 residents were interested in doing it and would help support the continuation of this. Sorry, this is getting a little bit off, but I thought it was really neat because by the time we went in toward the facility, there was a 3D printing lab, and that really interested a lot of the teenage kids from the community, and they would come in and they would utilize that after school. There was a huge art workshop that was just really, really awesome to see. And so they used their development as a hub for the community and for more engagement of community members to come in and do and work with folks. And then in terms of there was another question that kind of adds, I think, Christy, to your answer of who should congregations reach out to find out more about health needs and disparities in their communities. And I just wanted to make a plug for the reminder that your local hospital should be doing a community health needs assessment every 3 years, and it should be published on their website if they're a not-for-profit hospital, which most are. So that could just be a good place to start. It's definitely not the end-all be-all because it'll typically have a larger geographic focus, but it could be a good place.
And the public health departments of cities and states are also really good resources, and it varies by state, honestly, but a lot of times the public health departments will have those kinds of outreach initiatives as well. And I think the point that Mary was trying to make is important for us in the health field to realize is that while we think of health sometimes as high blood pressure, that the health and well-being of that community may be that 3D printing that brings the kids in to do 3D printing and encourages them in STEM careers that they might not have thought of otherwise. And we want to be very expansive when we decide what health is. And it's mental health, it's spiritual health, it is physical health, and all of those things contribute. And so I think you're finding that while we used to would have had very rigid definitions of, if this initiative doesn't drop blood pressure in this community, it's not a health initiative. That's not the way we look at it now. We look at all of the aspects holistically and know that that's the only way you can really benefit an entire community.
And I think the last question that I've seen come through is, what should a congregation know in planning for health equity issues as they plan their development?
We do have some initiatives that are faith-based specifically that allow the congregation itself to go through a health assessment. And that can also be applied to different communities within a neighborhood, say. And that whole outreach that Mary was talking about, and I believe that Enterprise does it through charrettes, through community engagement, dialogue. That's something that you want to include in the conversation and let them tell you how they see health. So I'll give an example of, we had an initiative with faith organizations, and it covered 13 different things. It covered everything from CPR to nutrition to active living to blood pressure. And we decided blood pressure was such a big issue in this particular community that we were going to really push that. And the faith organizations said, no, for us, we want to talk about neighborhood safety. We want to talk about how we don't feel comfortable walking in our neighborhood, how we don't have a grocery store that's walkable, how our sidewalks are torn up. And you have to really come back and meet people where they are, not where you necessarily want them to be. And so if you're stretching outside where your congregation is housed to other communities, that listening aspect, I think, is the first place to start. And I know that we learned that through our interchange with Enterprise as well.
Yeah, I think to just add to that, that's something that we see through the health action plan process. And so I think a lot of developers understand the connection between health and housing, and they will prioritize some of the like built environment based health promoting aspects, which are great. And so I don't want to diminish that, but I do think that if you have a limited budget and a limited ability of what you can really provide, and even if you don't, it really helps to engage with the community to prioritize what you're going to tackle first, where you're going to put your big budget items, et cetera. And that sometimes the more typical pieces aren't what is important. And a lot of that in our experience has come out of the health action plan process. And it's been just really great to hear the residents express what would be meaningful for them and what they would be more willing to partake in to improve some of the priority health needs that exist within the community. And I think there's actually some research out there that really illustrates these types of processes do increase uptake of the interventions that are eventually put into place. So I think community engagement is huge. The charrette process is a great way to do that. And Enterprise is able to provide some TA around what that looks like if folks are interested.
Another interesting experience that we had, and we were actually touring one of the developments that Enterprise had worked on here in the San Francisco area, that talks about not just the situation of the development itself, and it's an absolutely beautiful development, but while we were there, we were simply watching the interactions of people day to day, and the bus stopped, and a woman got out, a resident of that particular community. She got out at the bus stop. She had a motorized wheelchair. And she got out at an incline in San Francisco, if you can imagine. It was about like this. And so the bus driver, although he was not required to do it, stood behind her motorized chair long enough for her to get started up the hill. Now, all of us were sitting there aghast that, well, we need to have that bus stop moved to the bottom of the hill. We need to somehow accommodate that. Had we not been there to observe that, and had we not ever asked a resident how she felt about that particular situation of the bus stop, we would have missed a huge issue with her well-being, because she was worried at any time. She could slide back, she could fall off, and it was scary for her every time she went to get groceries. And so I think you can't discount how all those things are part of health, and how I would hate for my grandmother or my mother to be worried about going to get her groceries and having that fear and that traumatization experience. So I just think the power of observation and listening is so critical to the process.
Those are all of the questions that I have seen come through. Tim, have you seen any others we should be aware of?
No, I have not, Mary. If that's it, we will thank you and Christy for a great presentation. I love the way you are thinking outside the box to reach folk where they are about their health and share some great information with us. We are running a little ahead of schedule, so I am going to offer a gift to you and give you a little bit longer break to at least 3:00 p.m. We're waiting on one of our next presenters to log in to Zoom. So plan on coming back at 3:00 and then we'll have our next interactive poll. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. This is what we call in the business a filler. One of our presenters has not joined us yet. So I have a couple questions I'm going to ask everyone, given what we've talked about thus far, and then we'll proceed with our next poll and go from there. So given what you heard, what are people thinking about? And I ask that you feel free to use the chat and just drop in some responses. What are people thinking about now? Just tell us a little bit about the information that you've gleaned, how you might use it, and what specifically has jumped out to you. And we'll read a few of those. No responses yet. So people are just tired. I know it's been a long day, but so one question is, what is it about the start that stops people in entering into, my screen just jumped. What is it about the start that stops people in entering into this endeavor? I think people shared some information during the presentation about what some of the barriers are. I am going to touch on them a little bit in my presentation in a little bit. But it's really just not knowing where to get started, not feeling like they have the expertise to take on something this significant. And it's just really a fear of the unknown. But I'll touch on that a little bit in my presentation in a little bit more detail. Someone says that our current model is for the forgotten middle, but can possibly be used to develop lower income housing using the proceeds from our model when turned over to the charity or NPO. And that came from Ian Jones. I think, Ian, you have reached out to me before about your model. Thanks for sharing that information. Panky Miller, hey Panky. Panky says the unique space that religious institutions occupy in terms of being able to make an impact stands out to her. And the last one is, how do faith organizations find most interesting about taking on such a big project? What do faith-based organizations? I think they're mission driven. So I think they feel like it's part of their ministry to reach out to people, to serve people. And they also are people of God who feel like nothing is impossible. I think someone shared that in the chat. So that, even though it may seem daunting, with God's favor, they can tackle these projects and get them done. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and segue into the next poll, which is, given the many competing issues presently plaguing our communities, it's imperative that we prioritize so that we can be effective advocates for policies and resources to help address them. With that, our next poll asks, which policy priorities do you think would make the most impact on affordable housing needs in your community? And you can see the choices there: implementing housing solutions to overcome the medical and economic impacts of COVID-19, supporting an equitable recovery, increasing investments in federal programs that create and preserve affordable housing, creating housing policies that address systemic racial inequities and end cycles of poverty, providing resources to address climate change and improve disaster recovery and resilience, supporting investments in housing as part of our nation's infrastructure, and finally, implementing a range of programs to prevent and end homelessness. And we're about 26% of participants selecting a choice. We'll leave the poll up a little bit longer. We're about 57% of participants. A little over 60%. All right, Shannon, we're at 65%. Let's go ahead and close the poll. All right, looking at the results, it looks like creating housing policies that address systemic racial inequities and end cycles of poverty is the top choice with 33%. And that's in alignment with the presentation that Christy and Mary gave. And then also some of the things that Dan touched on. And I think some of the things that our next presenters are going to touch on as well. So if we can bring the poll down, Shannon. And we'll transition to our next panel. So I'm going to introduce both our next panelists, and we may switch orders if Amy hasn't joined us yet. So Amy Shope-Manzi is the Director of Grassroots Advocacy with the American Heart Association, and Candace Allen Mitchell is the Director of State and Local Policy for Enterprise. And they will now share some policy overview information and resources to enhance awareness and understanding of the issues surrounding health and affordable housing. Amy and Candace, we're looking forward to your presentations, and let me see who we will bring up first. We'll go ahead and.
Hey, Tim.
Can't see anyone. I hear a voice, but I can't see anyone. Who is that?
It's Amy.
Okay, hey, Amy. Okay, Amy, take it away.
Hey, Candace. I'm delighted to be talking with you all today. And I think someone was going to share some slides, but thrilled to talk to you all about advocacy. Candace and I had a chance to chat, and I'm going to talk about the sort of general why advocacy. Why do we do it? Why is it important in this work? And then she is going to talk a bit about the specifics of housing policy and advocacy in that space. And so I think between the two of us, we'll come back for questions at the end, and hopefully you'll find some good content there. So I lead the grassroots efforts at the American Heart Association. I had a chance to join for an earlier portion of the session today, had to jump off and do another presentation with a group and come right back. So I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm going to dive in. Our first slide, if we can go to that, I just want to talk for a minute about how we define advocacy. So often folks think of it as acting on behalf of the community, advocating for a particular group, speaking on behalf of people. They may not always know that we're doing the work we're doing. Also, it's defined in the dictionary as the act or process of supporting a cause or speaking out in favor of a cause or in opposition to an issue. This is the sort of asking nicely step of, talking to elected officials and saying, we support this. And finally, we talk at the Heart Association about our advocacy efforts, about the importance of kind of grassroots advocacy as applying pressure to people and institutions, to our state and local governments, our federal government, to regulatory bodies, applying some pressure to them via their constituent communications. And they're the folks who have the power to give us what we want to make the changes that are so important to us. And so advocacy is all of these, but I think it's often helpful to start the conversation with a shared understanding of that word because it's used so differently in so many different places. So if we go to the next slide, I want to talk for a second about why we do advocacy, why we make this a part of our programs and our work, whether it's in this housing space or whether it's in other healthy community work, looking at nutrition policy or tobacco policy, or making sure that we're addressing food deserts in a community, whatever it may be. Why is advocacy an important part of that strategy? And this is a great example of why. This is research from the Congressional Management Foundation. They've done years and years and years of analysis of elected officials and their staff and what moves them and sways them as they're making their decisions. And so this particular question that was posed to elected officials and their staff said, if your member or senator, your elected official has not already arrived at a firm decision on an issue, how much influence might the following advocacy strategies have on their decision? This is directed at a Washington office, but we find that a lot of this applies at state and local levels as we've had experience there as well. So in this case, the staff and the elected officials responded, and I illustrate a difference here, not to say that lobbyists are not valuable by any means, but that was not the tactic with the greatest influence. People sometimes think you need a highly paid lobbyist with influence and access to get your point across, and that just doesn't bear out as one of the most influential strategies. As we hear from elected officials, they say that in-person visits from constituents have a lot of influence over their decisions. And I would go further to say that it is the voice of constituents broadly, whether that comes in a series of phone calls or at a public meeting, or in the voice of constituents in the media that then is delivered to your elected official. The voice of citizen advocates has an immense influence over the outcome of our policy proposals, the way that our elected officials vote and move things, the regulations that they put in place. So that's why it's so important that advocacy is a part of our strategy when we're trying to address issues in our communities. We can go to the next slide. And so this slide, beyond meetings, I want to start by saying meetings are far and away the most effective of the citizen engagement, citizen advocacy strategies, but they look very different right now. In a COVID pandemic world, we're doing those virtually. We're finding that elected officials at the federal, state, local level, particularly the more constituents they have, the more they are fatigued by Zoom meetings and virtual meetings. So it's not to say that they won't take them by any means, but they look very different from when we've historically been able to visit an office and have an in-person dialogue and deliver materials. We have to be really inventive now about our strategies. So certainly still try to conduct those meetings, aim for Zoom. So there's still some face-to-face interaction, but conference calls are more preferred by the offices in many cases. We're hearing back, and that's certainly okay. A conference call meeting is better than no meeting at all. So we'll take those. But there are a lot of other tactics and ways that we engage folks to deliver the message. So I want to talk about those for just a moment. The use of media is so important in delivering the perspective of our community members. So we often use letters to the editor. We have folks who have an opinion on the issue, folks who are impacted, especially the voices of those who are impacted by the policy, write and submit their letter to the editor of local papers, especially if it's a timely issue. If you're in the midst of a development or you're seeking funding, it's a really, it's a compelling letter for editors to publish, and they're likely to do that. So we utilize that. We pitch an op-ed. We might, again, offer some folks with expertise and some folks who are impacted by the policy we're trying to shape. And we share those stories with reporters. We pitch the editorial board of a paper so that they might weigh in on a policy, or we host press events. And so we try to utilize the media, again, to create a public dialogue in this space that the end game of creating that public dialogue is engaging our elected officials in it as well. Phone calls, I mentioned those, calling ourselves or driving calls, hosting a phone bank or sending out a call to those in your community who are working on a project to make phone calls. We give talking points, we provide the phone number, we make it as easy as possible for people. We even do trainings on phone calls sometimes and just show them it's simple. A call to an elected official can feel intimidating for folks who haven't done that before. So while it may not seem like a huge ask, don't hesitate to say, we'll get on Zoom and I'll make a call. You can listen in and see how smoothly it goes and how easy it is. And again, equip them well with talking points, phone number they need, all that kind of thing. Social media can be a really effective way to get attention if the regulators or the elected officials you're trying to reach or influence have social media profiles. Having folks tag them and say, hey, Representative X or Councilman Y, we'd like to have a dialogue with you about this issue, or read this editorial, that sort of thing. You can get a good bit of attention. It takes only a few social media messages because it's such a public forum to get the attention of an elected official or a regulator or somebody in a prominent public position. Email, certainly still effective at getting the message across, although we all know what our inboxes look like with so much email flooding in. So recognize that that might not be our fastest or most impactful way, but it's still a very important way to communicate. And especially if we want to deliver resources, reports, other documents, that sort of thing, it can be important to email, obviously. Utilizing online action tools like petition sites, things like that can help make a splash. Certainly, as I've tried to do some, personal community change in my community, I've used sites like change.org and others to host a petition and garner signatures and get in touch with school boards and other local bodies. So certainly that can be effective and get some attention. And then partners. And, I know that others have mentioned, and Candace will too, emphasize this message, but coalition partners can be so important to this work. And so if we can go to the next slide and talk a little bit about how we can get started and what we can do right now. So it's important to identify where public policy, we sort of jumped in talking about how we might shift it, but it's important to step back and identify where public policy can help achieve your goals. So as we're talking about a goal of providing affordable housing, what is the role that our elected officials, that our regulatory bodies, our local councils can play in helping that work? Is it that we need zoning, or that we need funding, or is it that we need endorsement or support? What is it that we need? How can a public policy or official help move toward our goals? So that's the first step. Identify if there's a public policy need there. At the Heart Association, for example, we believe that our government officials do have a role to play in creating healthier communities through housing policy. So we know, and you guys all heard earlier about the ways that housing affects health and how important that is. We believe federal lawmakers can and should act to end discriminatory home loan lending practices, for example, and to ensure that people of all races and ethnicities and backgrounds have access to home ownership. We believe they should act to ensure that those who live in federally subsidized housing live in safe and healthy conditions. So there's a role for our federal lawmakers there. But we know that cities and states and communities hold the greatest power to affect our daily lives and to enact direct change in the design of our local communities. And so state and local governments should invest in local housing developments that promote equitable communities, long-term affordability, and healthy neighborhoods as a whole. So there's a role for all of our officials at various levels of government to play there. And so the first step is identifying where that intersects with your goals and what it is you're trying to achieve. And then identify the existing resources and groups doing this work I know these webinars and the information you've been presented today helps with that, presents some incredible resources. So identify the resources from groups like Enterprise and from those others that you're hearing from today who are doing this work, and utilize those. There is no need to recreate any sort of wheels when there are folks doing really awesome work in this space who can lend their expertise. And then rally your community, find the folks who are supportive of your efforts, who are excited about them, and the folks who will be impacted by your efforts, and bring their voices together. And once you do that, educate and train those folks, equip them to be advocates for your success. When you've identified the overlap in policy, and you've trained them and educated them and equipped them again to advocate, to speak out, and use their voice to help drive toward your goals. Next slide, please. So I want to talk, now is really the time to build relationships. The COVID realities are that government budgets across the board are really tight. They have naturally dedicated resources to helping our communities through the pandemic in a variety of ways. And priorities, in many cases, we're hearing from elected officials, have been dictated a bit by the environment we're all existing within right now. All of that said, this is certainly not the time to give up on any priorities that are outside where folks are acting at the moment in our government institutions. For so many, the need now, partway, long way into this pandemic, is greater than it has ever been. And so right now, one of the most effective things we can do, even if we don't have a current policy ask, is to build relationships with our elected officials. It's so important to start that dialogue before you need their decision on something, before we have an ask of them. And so that's a great place to start right now to help our elected officials, again, even if we don't have a policy ask right now, to help them get to know your community, your congregation, help them know the audience that would be served by projects, help them understand the need in your community, and really establish yourself as a credible source for information and for connections in the community. When a lawmaker or a regulator, community official sees a policy come toward them and they think, who should I talk to about this before I make my decision? You want to be top of mind. You want them to say, those folks have been sharing information with me and introducing me to others and talking to me about this issue and in this space of creating healthier communities and creating affordable housing. And you want them to think of you. So again, building that relationship and establishing yourself as their first resource is so important. And then you want to tell them the vital stories of community members that you want them to remember. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the value of storytelling in advocacy. We can deliver all sorts of facts and numbers and reports, and as helpful as all of that information is, as important as all of that information may be, it will be more memorable if it is served alongside a story of a person in the community who is impacted by the issue. And so you'll see just a little stat here, but it says a cognitive psychologist said that a fact, when you take a fact or a statistic and you wrap it up in a story, it is 22 times more memorable. And that's what we're trying to achieve here. When we are introducing ourselves and our issues to elected officials, we want them to remember us, to remember the folks who are affected, to remember the information we've shared with them at a time when they need to make a decision and we may not be right there with them. And so we're trying to create that memory for them. And that's why stories are so very important. It's why you often hear, if you listen to committee hearings or local council meetings, you often hear as they discuss an issue, folks who will say, I talked to so-and-so in the community, and here's what they told me about the impact of this. They share those stories. It's the way we communicate and persuade one another as human beings. So if we go to the next slide, just a couple notes about storytelling. There's a gentleman there in a picture who was sharing his personal experience with heart disease and what it has meant and how it has affected his life, as we were talking about the need to fund research into heart disease. Again, stories just help put a face to the facts and figures, and stories, the human interest side, is what helps our legislators connect emotionally with our issue. So that putting that face and that person to the issue is so important. They also serve the human interest side of an issue, right? Facts and figures are important and they're great, but serving the human interest side also helps us to gain that media attention we talked about and drive that public dialogue. When people can see the impact on their community, then they're more likely to engage. And so it helps drive media attention. It helps new advocates come to the issue when they can make that connection on an emotional and personal level. And so it's really important that we not leave out or forget this part of stories, even as we're thinking about our public advocacy work. Next slide, please. So there are some tips here around crafting your story. I want to turn it to Candace in just a moment, but I want to share that we have resources, we have story trainings. There's a little bit of a structure here, but we have a number of different story trainings. We'd certainly be happy from the Heart Association to share those with any of you and your communities to help folks craft their stories in a way that is appropriate for the situation, whether they're delivering it to a lawmaker or they're talking to a reporter and helping to drive that public dialogue. So we certainly have some resources there to help you. Let's go to the next slide. And I just want to take a minute, just 1 second, to tell you about our You're the Cure program. So at the Heart Association, we are working to build healthier communities through all sorts of policies. I've mentioned a number of them. And we're thrilled to be partnering with Enterprise and with local community groups in this effort. If you'd like to know more about the work we're doing at the Heart Association through our You're the Cure, that's our grassroots advocacy network. It's a few 100,000 people across the country, and we'd love for you to be a part of that big effort to create healthier communities. You can join us really simply. It takes just a second. If you have a mobile device near you or you want to come back to it after the call, just jot this down. You can text the word Atlanta to the phone number 46839 to join our You're the Cure program, and we'll get back in touch with you and share more about our work to build healthier communities. And if you'll go one more slide, I just wanted to share my contact information and that of some of our local advocacy staff in the Atlanta area. Kim Van Veen is our grassroots manager there. She works on my team. And then Michael and Laura are government and community relations directors in Georgia and Atlanta, respectively, and would be really excited to get to know you and to support your work and to offer some of the resources of the Heart Association to your efforts. So don't hesitate to call on us if we can be helpful in supporting advocacy or anything else in this space. And with that, I will turn it to Candace, and I think we'll maybe save questions for after both presentations.
All right, thanks and good afternoon, everyone. I am so happy that you've all answered this call to learn more about how to use your resources to be part of this faith-based development initiative. And Tim, thank you for your leadership on this and for having me join on and share some policy considerations. I'm Candace Allen Mitchell, the State and Local Policy Director for Enterprise Community Partners in our Southeast market. And you've heard from Amy about how to become a better advocate and some tools and strategies to get there. And I'd like to share more about why we should champion housing affordability and what some of those policy initiatives are. So first, let's talk about the why. Next slide. I'll talk about 4 components: the need for affordable housing, housing as a human right, and that's the philosophy that kind of undergirds a lot of our government advocacy, housing trust funds and tenant protections, which are some specific policy initiatives that we support, and then community engagement and building coalition. Next slide. So there is a deep and critical need for increased housing supply for affordable housing. In the United States, the housing shortage is most severe for households with extremely low incomes at or below the poverty line, and that's at about 30% AMI. You heard a lot of this from an earlier presentation from Dan, and I'll just briefly share more about that. So according to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, there are 10.9 million extremely low income renter households and only 7.3 million rental homes available at an affordable rate. 3.3 million of those affordable rental homes are occupied by higher income households, which leaves only about 4 million of the available affordable housing stock for those who are most in need. There is a need gap of 7 million for renters with extremely low incomes around the country. And as you heard earlier, Georgia has a shortage of about 196,000. So your contribution to increase capacity for affordable housing is critical. Next slide, please. So as a reminder, cost burdens exist when a household pays more than 30% of their income on housing. Severe cost burdens occur when a household expends more than 50% of their income on housing. So as a result of the need gap in our housing market, 86% of low-income renters are cost burdened or severely cost burdened. There are over 9 million extremely low-income renter households that are cost burdened, which means they spend more than 30% of their income. And more than 7 million of those renter households are severely cost burdened, meaning they spend 50% or more on housing. So in those experiencing the highest burdens are minimum wage workers and people with disabilities who rely on Social Security and other forms of public assistance. So these severe cost burdens that we're discussing today have consequences that reach far beyond housing. And you heard some of that from earlier presentations on the connection between housing and health. And so these negative impacts include, next slide, please. Include educational outcomes for children, the mental and physical health of members of the household, stable transportation, and access to quality and healthy foods. So addressing the need for housing quality in affordable homes improves outcomes for families in many ways, and it also helps interrupt cycles of poverty. Next slide. I also want to discuss a bit about the belief that housing is a human right and how that ends up triggering the responsibility of our elected and government officials. So 75% of the United States population believes that adequate housing is a human right, and 2/3 of those people believe that government programs are responsible for ensuring access to adequate housing for those with the highest need. However, large cutbacks in the 1980s led to devastating reductions to housing funding at the federal level, and many of those programs were never restored. And the cuts were largely responsible for rampant rates of homelessness and the homelessness that we see today. Reports of homelessness, next slide please, have surged more than 1,300% in the past decade. Only 1 in 4 of income eligible renters in this country receive assistance. As a result, many local governments and municipalities have adopted the housing as a human right approach and sought programming to decriminalize homelessness and increase the housing stock for those with extreme need. According to the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the human right to adequate housing consists of 7 elements. So the security of tenure is the first, the availability of services, materials, and infrastructure, second, the affordability is third, accessibility, fourth, habitability, fifth, location, 6, and cultural adequacy, 7. So using this human rights framework, every right has a corresponding duty on the part of government to respect, protect, and fulfill that right. And so that means that government should devote resources to the public through, next slide, please, through housing vouchers, tax credits, inclusionary zoning, or due process protections from eviction or foreclosure, right to counsel, ensuring habitable conditions, and then also decriminalizing homelessness. So those are end up being the main themes of a lot of our advocacy strategies and policy strategies and the work that we do. Next slide. Next slide. At Enterprise, part of the work that we do is identify opportunities to expand resources that address some of those critical challenges to housing affordability. And so one of my main priorities, and that I've teamed up with other members of our advocacy community to do, is to identify opportunities for statewide housing trust funds. State and local housing trust funds, they help advance the way governments support affordable housing by guaranteeing that revenues are available each year to support critical housing needs. These funds are established by legislation, ordinance, or popular vote. And they create state or local housing trust funds as a proactive step for housing advocates so that you can make a change on the system that typically has limited access to housing for those in need. So in 2019, state and local housing trust funds generated $2.5 billion for affordable homes. 47 states and the District of Columbia have created 58 housing trust funds, which reflects a recognized value in committing public revenues to accomplish housing objectives that address both homelessness and rental assistance. So there are three key elements to a state or local housing trust fund, and that's first, next slide, please. Government administration and oversight. And so we need elected officials to support, but also that they accept ownership and responsibility for the fund so that they can address those critical needs that we identify. And then also government agencies can form community boards, which include housing advocates, banks, realtors, developers, labor and service providers, and other community residents so that they can have a diversified coalition in effectuating and operating the fund. The Housing Trust Fund also requires programs. Next slide, please. Programmatic issues should be defined in the ordinance or legislation that establish the Housing Trust Fund, and that's why it's so important to have that diverse coalition be represented as you build it out so that the programs needed for communities are identified early on. And this ensures that key operating components are not subject to the whims of a changing administration. So a housing trust fund, because of its legislative nature, would surpass any elected official's term and be something that's really more of a permanent response to housing needs in a community. It also needs funding. So housing trust funds should be secured by dedicated revenue sources committed to general funds on its behalf. By legislation or ordinance, a certain percentage or amount of funding can be automatically deposited into the Housing Trust Fund each year. And this eliminates the need for housing advocates to argue over scarce resources each year, and it gives them this reliance on a continuous stream of funding. And so in Georgia, we have a framework for a housing trust fund that has really been helpful. It's the Georgia State Housing Trust Fund for the Homeless, which was established in 1988. And it receives an annual appropriation of $3 million, which is used to match federal funding and provide homelessness assistance grants. It helps to develop other subsidies for state and local programs. And so a lot of affordable housing developers are able to rely on this mechanism if they meet the requirements of access to the fund. And the $3 million annual appropriation doesn't lapse each year. And that's another feature that's really important to a housing trust fund. If all of the funds aren't expended at the end of the year, you want them to be non-lapsing so that they can be used in a subsequent year. And so the programs offered through Georgia's State Housing Trust Fund for the Homeless include homelessness prevention. It provides services for those at imminent risk of homelessness. It also provides rapid rehousing, which offers resources to quickly move individuals from temporary housing into permanent housing, street outreach, which allows for members to build relationships and provide resources to unsheltered individuals who are reluctant to enter other programs. Emergency shelter, which allows them to provide immediate accommodation for individuals and families who are homeless. And this program has served 7,243 adults and children. And so at Enterprise, we're working to expand on this model to meet a broader need statewide and in partnership with other housing advocates, realtors, home builders, banks, and more. Another priority, next slide please, is tenant protections. So 30% of Georgia households rent their homes and over half are cost burdened. Georgia has the nation's third fastest eviction process with no requirement of written notice, no requirement of a written notice period or allowance for time of tenants to cure their defect for non-payment. And so although tenants have 7 days after an eviction filing to cure their non-payment, by this point, they're no longer obligated, or they're now obligated to pay penalties and court costs in addition to having the eviction filing on their records. So essentially, they're adding on additional expenses after already having been able to meet their rent payment for the month. So 40 states have a written notice requirement with the right to cure, and that notice requirement is anywhere between 1 and 15 days. Georgia has no such law currently. And so we are working with housing advocates and our government affairs expert to pass HB 408 in Georgia, which would establish a written notice prior to filing an eviction proceeding and an opportunity to cure that defect within 7 days. Next slide, please. And so I spoke a little bit about some of the main priorities that we're focusing on now, but this, the next component of what I'll discuss just really applies to anything that ends up becoming an issue for you. And so as you're getting farther along in this process, zoning issues may come up or other policy implications for your development that may require that you advocate or seek the assistance of your local or state government. And so through that work, it'll be really important to engage your congregations, your communities, and really build coalition around the need. So for community engagement and coalition building, many local housing needs are challenged by just a fear of bringing affordable housing in their communities. And this is usually characterized by a concept called NIMBYism. NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. And so you'll hear many people agree that housing affordability is an issue, but they don't necessarily want new affordable housing developed in their community specifically. And that's been a huge barrier when it comes to zoning or any other issue that ends up impacting a local community. And so avoiding and overcoming opposition to affordable rental housing is key to producing and preserving affordable homes. So how can we curtail this problem? Next slide, please. So one thing that we do up front is as you're working through creating or developing a policy, you want to reduce any unnecessary approvals at the onset. And that'll largely be up to legislators or attorneys you're working with to develop the law itself. But as you launch educational campaigns and educate your congregations and communities about a policy that you might want to advance, it's really important that you start by informing the public, local government, and elected officials about the need of the policy that you're seeking to move forward, and really be a champion for that policy in your communities. You want to utilize credible research to support your message and dispel myths about the types of renters who are in need of affordable housing. There's a lot of stigma attached to affordable housing. And so the more you learn, the more you'll be able to really address those stigmas and challenge them head on as you seek to increase capacity in your communities. You want to engage neighborhood groups and organizations early on in the process so they really feel a part of the work you're doing. And you want to be sure to address any legitimate concerns that are brought up in opposition to any of the work that you're doing. Next slide, please. And then it's important to build coalition. And really this helps to diversify the voices that are at the table when you are trying to move an agenda forward. And the faith-based community is no stranger to building coalitions in their communities, but I'll gloss over a few of the important factors in doing this. And you want to make sure that your coalitions are multi-sector and represent a diverse and broad expertise. You want to identify mutual needs and interdependencies. So identifying areas that you connect on with other members in your community and why you need each other to move a particular policy or agenda item forward. And then you want to eliminate some of the cross-sector language barriers. For example, in housing, we talk a lot about AMI, or we use so many acronyms that a lot of people don't always understand the language. And I think that it's important to be cognizant of your audience when you are trying to connect back, and just be clear about what your needs are, because you'll find that once a lot of those barriers, those language barriers are removed, there is more understanding than you might expect. And then you want to be sure to understand the capacity of the organizations that you're working with. Some of them may be operating outside of your specialty. They may agree with you that a particular issue is important, but it might not be at the same priority level. And so just understanding that and balancing that with the work you do is critical. And so the faith-based community has a long proven history of elevating voices in the community. And so my goal today was just to name some specifics that we see as upcoming priorities and give a few tools to help as you build out your platforms and leverage coalitions in the housing space. I've provided some links to resources that I think would be incredibly helpful. At Enterprise Community Partners, we do so much work to help provide technical assistance and policy analysis. And so you can find a wealth of information there. I've also provided links to other resources that we often rely on from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, House ATL, and Georgia Advancing Communities Together, or Georgia ACT. You'll find links there. And I'll be dropping a link in the chat to a great piece of research. You may have received this already from Tim, I'm not sure, but it's leveraging property owned by faith-based organizations to create affordable homes and public benefit. And this was a research piece from our federal team. And so if you have time, to look it over, I think it'll be incredibly helpful to the work that you're doing. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for your time. I provided my contact information. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And now Amy and I will take your questions from this presentation.
So Candace, maybe I can read a few of these that are coming through in the chat. Shannon is sending through. Are the Housing Trust Fund matches for federal homeless grants applicable to pre-development expenses?
I can check on that. I haven't seen that. So yeah, I'll have to check on that to get a better answer. I know it's a limited contribution each year, and typically it's to provide direct response for homelessness. And so I haven't seen it be used in pre-development, but I can't answer that definitively now.
Are there legal issues that faith-based organizations should be aware of when it comes to advocacy that might put them at risk?
I think that there may be, and I'll have to find a resource that provides some helpful information, but I do think that some direct lobbying or advocacy can be a challenge for faith-based organizations and 501c3s. And so a majority of your work can't be focused on direct advocacy. I forget the percentage. And I think, so that is something that you need to be cognizant of. Do you have anything to add to that, Amy?
I was going to say the same. Different organizations use different tests, whether it's no substantial part or whether it's a particular percentage. So it can't be the primary focus of your work, but there is some allowable amount of advocacy work that is acceptable. And I think so much of the work we talked about, though it's in the advocacy sphere, public dialogue, raising the conversation, telling the stories, those aren't the same, certainly, as a direct lobbying activity. And so if there's anxieties about some of that lobbying restrictions, certainly seek guidance from your legal consultants, whoever it may be. But if there's some anxiety about that, consider all of those pieces of this sphere. Again, the public dialogue, the storytelling, the media work to create a dialogue around these issues that doesn't fall into that lobbying space. And then one more question, Candace, here. Can you speak to rezoning challenges and what to be aware of?
So this will be a case-by-case issue, but what I've heard from other markets doing this work is that depending on where your property is located, it may be zoned for a purpose that you don't ultimately intend to use it as. And so you will need to engage local government to make that zoning change. And so, as that comes to be, you just want to make sure that your property is legally able to be developed in the way you intend, and you may have to go through several zoning processes to have that done. We can start to work on a toolkit to kind of make that easier to implement, but yeah, that's the extent of it. I don't have specifics, but.
And if you need to change zoning, I saw someone in the comments have said, stay away from rezoning projects, but if you need to do that, if you need to address it, and Candace at Enterprise or we at the Heart Association can be helpful in supporting your work there, don't hesitate to reach out to us. And then I can't speak to this one, but I saw a general question in the chat. Does Health Atlanta support affordable housing efforts in the municipalities surrounding the city of Atlanta?
So House ATL has been focused directly on the city of Atlanta. The Metro Atlanta Housing Task Force out of the Atlanta Regional Commission has been focused on the Atlanta regional area, and they provide great resources. I can find a link to connect you to them.
Awesome.
I don't see any more questions either.
I don't. Thanks everyone for the great questions and for the opportunity to join you. This is really exciting work and I'm honored.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Awesome job, Amy and Candace. Excellent information on the importance of advocacy and policy in our work to create more opportunities. Thank you for your time and sharing with us today. It's that time. We'll now take our last and final we're going to do a 5-minute break, but yeah, let's make it a 6-minute break. So I give you an extra minute. Let's get back at 4 o'clock and then we can get through the rest of the presentation, and we'll have one last participant poll when you get back to us. Thank you. For the remaining of our time today, we're going to discuss a process and a template for helping faith-based organizations conduct an initial assessment of their readiness to go forward with developing affordable housing and community facilities. To set the stage for that, our final poll asks, how much experience does your house of worship or faith-based partners have in regards to affordable housing challenges? Please take a few moments to answer the poll. I know folks are tired, but please answer the poll. About 25% of people voting, 30. So the choices are, we have no idea, can't wait to learn. We have discussed taking action, but don't really know how to do this. We have some good ideas for how we will move forward. We are actively working to solve affordable housing issues in our community. And we have built or are planning to build affordable housing and or community facilities. With about 40% of participants answering. Folks may not be back from break either, but we'll give it a few more seconds. All right, Shannon, we're at about 50%. Can we see the results? So it looks like the people that are still brave enough to be on the call, out of them, 33% have discussed taking action, but don't really know how to do this. And next up is a tie between we have no idea, can't wait to learn, and we have some good ideas for how we'll move forward. So this next part will cover some of those things to help you have a better grasp of where to begin. Shannon, you can close the poll if it's not already closed. All right. Before I walk you through Enterprise's FBDI Organizational Assessment Worksheet tool, I want to, for those not already familiar, quickly give a high-level overview of the FBDI. The approach of the FBDI is to connect houses of worship to intellectual and financial capital that will assist them in making informed go or no-go decisions about development of their underutilized real estate assets into affordable housing and other community facilities. If a house of worship decides to go forward with a development project, then Enterprise seeks to support them. The next slide, if you haven't already advanced, Adam, seeks to, if a house of worship decides to go forward with a development project, the Enterprise seeks to support them with capital, training, technical assistance, and access to vetted professionals with the overall goal of assisting them in taking their development vision from conception to conversation, to clarity, to construction, to completion. Why are we doing this? Simple. land prices continue to rise, which is a barrier to producing the levels of affordable housing that is needed. Houses of worship who can put their land into deals can significantly reduce the cost of projects while at the same time aligning with their missions. Next slide, please. While the FBDI is relatively new to Enterprise's Southeast market, it is not new to Enterprise. It got started in 2006 in Washington, D.C., led by the hard work of Reverend David Bowers, Enterprise's Mid-Atlantic VP and market leader. It expanded to Baltimore, Maryland in 2013 with a very successful partnership with the University of Baltimore, where a curriculum was created specifically for a cohort of faith-based organizations to train them in the development process. In 2017, Enterprise celebrated the 10th anniversary of FBDI with a forum and a gala. The gala was actually held in the banquet or multi-purpose facility at Israel Manor, the project that Veronica spoke about earlier. In 2018, FBDI in the Mid-Atlantic market achieved its goal of producing or preserving 1,000 units of affordable homes and now has committed to an additional 1,000 units by 2023. Today, Enterprise is well on its way to expanding FBDI to additional markets, with the Southeast being one of them. And over the next 5 years, has established the goal of creating housing for 20,250 people through this initiative. Next slide, please. Over the course of the last 14 years, Enterprise has learned a great deal from partnering and working closely with houses of worship. First, a lack of familiarity with the development process or fear of the unknown often leads to no action on the part of the houses of worship. Reverend David Bowers, who spearheads the FBDI for Enterprise, often says that he learned a lot of things in seminary school about the Old Testament, New Testament, how to provide counseling and dealing with death, but what he did not learn was how to read a performer. Given that, we know that it is critically important that extensive technical assistance is often needed to help build the capacity for houses of worship and other nonprofit entities. Another thing that is critical for houses of worship is having connections to intellectual capital, such as access to local government officials, experienced developers, and legal representation that can assist them in making informed go or no-go decisions. And if it's a go, then also access to folk that can offer assistance with completing the development. We've learned that the faith community and developers don't operate on the same timelines. Developers are focused in the moment with a sense of urgency, whereas houses of worship tend to think in eternity. There needs to be a compromise. Developers need to slow down and houses of worship need to speed up before too many come to Jesus meetings need to be held. Often mistrust and lack of appreciation by both houses of worship and developers can derail a partnership even before it gets started, when the parties don't value what the other is contributing to the project. All sides need to be clear up front, what's in it for me. And finally, the clergy leader needs to be actively engaged in casting the vision, gaining buy-in from his congregation, and not be afraid to delegate day-to-day management activities or authority, but not responsibility. Next slide, please. Enterprise's FBDI Organizational Assessment Joint Venture Worksheet is designed to be a tool to assist houses of worship in doing an initial organizational assessment of issues related to joint venturing with a development partner, either nonprofit or for-profit. The worksheet consists of 6 main topic areas, including visioning/organizational planning, preliminary site assessment, evaluating your potential partnership, key considerations for your joint venture agreement, and a checklist for joint venture roles and pre-development resources. Next slide, please. Under each of the 6 categories, there are a series of questions that help houses of worship think critically about their interest in building affordable housing and or community facilities on the undeveloped or underdeveloped land that they own. Listed on these next 2 slides are some of the key questions, and I'll just highlight a few for sake of time. Under visioning or organization planning, What is your vision for the site? Have you started to think about it, or is it just a germ? What is the decision-making process for your house of worship? Is it a top-down? Do you have to get buy-in from a board of trustees? Or what is the administrative structure that you have to convince that development is a good idea? Is there commitment or consistent among leadership in the congregation on your vision? Is the leader thinking one way and the congregation thinking another? On the preliminary site assessment, is the site open space and underutilized parking lot, or is it an existing facility or something else? Those are critical things to know when you're starting to plan how you approach development. Does your property allow for residential development? Do you know the density? Does your site need to be rezoned? We talked about that a little bit in the last panel. Are there other pending and neighboring rezonings? If so, a consultant will be needed. Under evaluating potential partnerships, do your missions and priorities align with a potential joint venture partner that you partner with? What expertise does your partner have? What else is important to know about your partner? It's important that you solicit reference letters, that you just don't go by a recommendation from a church member, that you really do your due diligence and ask for reference and talk to people, Google people. Next slide, please. Under joint venture key considerations, some of the questions that we're asking you to think about are, is there a long-term ownership requirement for the house of worship? Do you want to own it a long time, or do you want it to be turnkey, just have it built and then turn it over to someone else to manage? Are there any economic empowerment or other goals you would like to be a part of your partnership? So do you want a source of revenue to come from the development that you're considering? And who is responsible for decision-making, and how will each partner participate? So is it a 50-50 determination on things going forward, or is there one partner that's making most of the decisions? Under the joint venture roles checklist, there's a series of questions that we ask you to consider, and that includes who will be responsible for preparing project budgets? Who is the financial consultant if necessary? If you need a bank, who is the bank point of contact? And if you're attempting to do a tax credit or a low-income housing tax credit deal, who will be the syndicator point of contact? So the person that is interfacing with the person who is providing the investment from the tax credits. And then finally, pre-development resources. These are some things that you need to consider on the front end about things that you will need. So early pre-development resources, land acquisition or sale to the partnership. There'll be professional costs that you have to consider: architect, zoning analysis, development consultants, legal, financing, application fees. All these things are resources that you'll need to have available to you as you're considering your project. And these resources are considered for the project on the front end, but not available until construction closing. So you have to have some type of reserves or some funding to kind of help cover some of these costs. Next slide, please. Adam, if you could drop the organizational assessment fillable PDF document in the chat, and then also maybe bring it up. I just want to quickly show our participants what it actually looks like. So this document is an enterprise created document, as I explained. If we just scroll through it, Adam, if you can enlarge it and scroll through it. And it's in the chat as well, I think. So if you want to. So again, it's just prefaces a little bit about what the FBDI is, but the document itself has all those questions that I just went through listed on the left-hand side. And then on the right side, we just ask you to fill in your initial thoughts. Now, I will say that you won't know all the answers to these questions up front, but this can be a useful tool to get you starting to think about how you want to proceed, how you want to think about whether or not you're close to being able to move forward with a development project. Adam, that's enough. You can go back to the slides, please. So the worksheet, like I said, is a fillable PDF format, and we encourage houses of worship that are considering doing a housing or community facility project to take the time to answer these questions, as we believe that it will help you along your journey. With that, I'll try and answer a few questions. Let's see. I see a question. I'm not sure if it's particular specific to me. It says, I help homeless men and want to provide temporary housing for them. Can any of these organizations help me do that? I'm not sure if you belong to a faith-based organization, but we can talk offline and I can plug you into specific organizations that deal with that type of population, and maybe you can explore some potential partnerships with them. And I'm trying to see the best way to field the question. See the question. I think there's a question. How much, this question, how much equity do you have to put in to add to the construction loan equal 100%? I guess that will be determined on a case-by-case basis, depending on what the project is and how you structure your partnership with the joint venture organization. And all that is negotiated, and you can determine, what it is, who's going to take on that responsibility, and how much they're going to bring to the table. See a question, I got that one. All right. Shannon, if there's other questions that I'm missing, if you can send them to me. Let's see, one new message. Not seeing any. Okay. With that then, Adam, we can move to the closing. The definition of a clarion call is a strongly expressed demand or request for action. Thus, before we conclude this afternoon, we would like to leave you with a call to action. Next slide. Some of this has already been covered by others, but to reiterate, our current situation is dire. There's no doubt about that. There are only 36 affordable available rental homes for every 100 extremely low income renters. And I think that was highlighted by Dan and others. When it comes to affordability, a person would have to work 90 hours a week to afford a 2-bedroom rental. And the situation is even more profound for people of color, who are more likely than whites to pay over half their income on rent and make up 80% of eviction cases. Again, that was already highlighted. And as we're all well aware by now, COVID-19 has made these issues worse and even more apparent. Next slide, please. Houses of worship are acutely aware that simply providing adequate and affordable housing, while critically important, is not the end all, as evident in the many different ministries many of them take on to tackle issues such as education, hunger, and providing employment opportunities. However, without a safe, affordable home, those other things are often a meaningful yet short-lived stopgap. Next slide, please. Houses of worship and the faith community can be an important part of providing both affordable housing and supportive services. And Enterprise is here to help them figure out the housing piece through the Faith-Based Development Initiative. Next slide. Given the dire current situation and the documented significant need, will you make a commitment today to become an advocate for affordable housing within your communities? Will you join Enterprise and our other partners in the building of a coalition centered around faith-based development opportunities that provides affordable housing options for low and moderate income residents? Will you sign up to receive notifications regarding future FBDI opportunities? Will you commit to joining our spring and fall FBDI webinar series entitled Feeding Faith Leaders with Community Fervor, intended to continue educating the faith community on the development process as either a participant or a presenter? The spring series will kick off next month in April. Will you prioritize affordable housing by considering building affordable housing and/or community facilities on your underutilized or unutilized property that you own? Finally, will you commit to completing the FBDI Organizational Assessment Joint Venture Worksheet tool so that Enterprise and the partners that we work with have a better understanding how we might better assist you with your aspirations for your house of worship and communities, and thus turning amen into action? Thank you for joining and sticking with us throughout this afternoon. Thanks again to all of our presenters, and a special heartfelt thank you to our partner, the American Heart Association, and contributing sponsor, the Kresge Foundation. Have a blessed rest of the day, everyone.